Wow. Didn't double check to see if I wanted to go on. That's crazy. Anyway, now I am online. It's online. Online. Oh, good, it corrected. We're on part 3. Anyway, and now, what? I don't spend enough time in the store, and it shows. Sales have been horrible. And, well, we had the book squid incident, which uh, thought it got back to Quinix. Maybe he can handle it better than I could. Pokey. Is give a wolf a cookie ASMR. They're tasty though, and they're just like the butter cookies that come out every holiday season. Mm. So, hope everyone had a good week. I guess I do it in just chatting screen. But what would the fun be in that? I mean, really, in what, me just walk off screen and go into the office, but I don't want to go into the office. But I'll meet you in the chat room. Okay, cool. All right then. What's up? Welcome to chat. The only thing I've seen so far is my wonderful Stream Elements announcement saying that I am online. And wait, we're not doing Sherlock Holmes. That was last night. Curse you, Stream Elements! I don't know. But we're doing Fairy Tales tonight. It is Friday. It's Friday night is the night for Fairy Tales. And while I was offline, I got sub from Papa Penguin. If you're not currently watching Papa Penguin, why not? Of course, I can't spell with it in, but yeah. He dropped me a sub today while I was offline, and just want to thank him. So, if anyone wants to go hang out with a literal cool bird, go check out Papa Penguin. That was me shaking my bottle of Gamer Subs, which I am not sponsored by. Dang, what cookie I had with me. Man, I'm just floating around on the screen, aren't I? I didn't know there was a muck. A muck, a muck, a muck, a muck, a muck, a muck, a muck. But I have water, so I can do that redeem whole hydration thing. I've got my wonderful book of toasts and stories. So if anyone redeems those, I've got them on me too. I'm going to try my damnedest to keep track of it. Because I do get to be a little bit of on the oblivious side when I'm doing stuff. Especially reading. But, what was I doing? I had goals. That's not the one I wanted. Go there. Where's my goal chart? Oh, manage goals. Okay, I've got 2 goals right now. One for 15 subs, so I can, get that extra emote slot. That's really the only reason. I'd like to have subscribers, but I don't really expect anyone to really subscribe to me that much or for any reason. It's nice if you do, but it's not really required. And I also have the follower goal. I threw a number like 250 out there. Seems reasonable enough, right? I mean, I got 220. 230 is just like 30 more people. Okay. Let's see. Friday Night Fairy Tales. And let's see, what time is it? It is 9:07. So we've got a couple more minutes before I get into the book. I am going to read fairy tales because that's what we do here. We read fairy tales because we like fairy tales. Everyone should like fairy tales. If you don't like fairy tales, what's your problem? Sorry, I had to blow my nose because it is cold and, noses run when it's cold. Let's see, what all do I have open? I'm going to see if I can test my sound alerts. That's not what I wanted. Because I've been having sound alert problems for who freaking knows how long. First, I'm going to check Blurp because hello, Blurp. Blurp cuts off too. Well, that sucks. I don't know why. All my sound keeps getting truncated. And it's just freaking annoying. And as annoying for me as it is for people trying to jump scare me when I'm trying to read. See, it cut off again. Just doesn't make any sound at all. And it drives me crazy. See, that's all I get. I get, like, the beat, and that's it. And I can get it working for, like, maybe half an hour or so, and then it just stops all over again. I don't know why. I don't know how. It just keeps doing it. And I find it really damn annoying. Refresh cache for current page. Okay, we'll try this one more time because there's absolutely no reason it should be doing this that I can think of. But it does. And someday, hopefully, it'll clear up. But today is not that day. Anyway, we are at 9:10 Central Standard Time p.m. So let's head over to the reading area, shall we? And I do have drinks, so I'm gonna hydrate occasionally. It'll look really funny because my model does weird things when I drink, such as twitching like that. Excuse me. But we be doing the fairy tale thing. And our first story for the night, The White Slipper, from the Orange Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there lived a king who had a daughter just 15 years old. And what a daughter! Even the mothers who had daughters of their own could not help allowing that the princess was much more beautiful and graceful than any of them. And as for the fathers, if one of them ever beheld her by accident, he could talk of nothing else for the whole day afterwards. Of course, the king, whose name was Bellicin, was a complete slave to his little girl from the moment he lifted her from the arms of her dead mother. Indeed, he did not seem to know that there was anyone else in the world to love. Now, Diamantina, for that was her name, did not reach her 15th birthday without proposals for marriage from every country under heaven, and a few that weren't. But the suitor whom he might, the king always said to him, nay. Behind the palace was a large garden stretched away from the foot of some hills, and more than one river flowed through. Hither the princess would come each evening towards sunset, attended by her ladies, and gather herself the flowers that were to adorn her rooms. She also brought with her a pair of scissors to cut off the dead blooms, and a basket to put them in, so that when the sun rose next morning he might see nothing unsightly. When she had finished this task, she would take a walk through the towns, so that the poor people might have a chance of speaking with her, and telling her of their troubles. And then she would seek out her father, and together they would consult over the best means of giving him the help that they need. But what has all of this to do with the white slipper? My readers may ask. Have patience. You'll see. Next to his daughter, Balison loved hunting, and it was his custom to spend several mornings every week chasing the boars which abounded in the mountains a few miles from the city. One day, rushing downhill as fast as he could, he put his foot into a hole and fell, rolling into a rocky pit of brambles. The king's wounds were not very severe, but his face and hands were cut and torn, while his feet were in a worse plight still, for instead of proper hunting boots, he only wore sandals to enable him to run more swiftly. In a few days, the king was all as well as ever, and the signs of scratches were almost gone, but one foot still remained very sore, where a thorn had pierced deeply and had festered. The best doctors in the kingdom treated it with all their skill. They bathed and policed and bandaged, but it was in vain. The foot only grew worse and worse, and became daily more swollen and painful. After everyone had tried his own particular cure and found it to fail, there came news of a wonderful doctor in some distant land who had healed the most astonishing diseases. On inquiring, it was found that he never left the walls of his own city, and expected his patients to come to see him. But by dint of offering a large sum of money, the king persuaded the famous physician to undertake the journey to his own court. On his arrival, the doctor was led at once into the king's presence, and made a careful examination of the foot. "Alas, your majesty," he said when he was finished, "this wound is beyond the power of man to heal, but though I cannot cure it, I can at least deaden the pain and enable you to walk without much suffering." The doctor's name was Scholes. "Oh, if you can do only that," cried the king, "I will be grateful to you for my life. Give your own orders. They shall be obeyed." "Then let your majesty bid the royal shoemaker to make a shoe out of a goat skin, very loose and comfortable, whilst I prepare a varnish of paint over it, of which I alone have the secret." This is Dr. Scholl. So saying, the doctor bowed himself out, leaving the king more cheerful and hopeful than he had been in a very long time. The days passed very slowly with him during the making of the shoe and the preparation of the varnish. But on the 8th morning the physician appeared, bringing with him the shoe in a case. He drew it out to slip it on the king's foot, and over the goatskin he had rubbed a polish so white that the snow itself was not more dazzling. "While you wear this shoe, you will not feel the slightest pain," said the doctor, "for the balsam which I have rubbed inside it and out has its healing balm, the quality of strengthening the material it touches, so that, even when your majesty to live 1,000 years, you would find the slipper just as fresh at the end of time as it is now." This really is a story about Dr. Scholes. Wow. The king was so eager to put it on that he hardly gave the physician time to finish. He snatched it from the cape and thrust his foot into it, nearly weeping for joy when he found he could walk and run as easily as any beggar boy. "What can I give you?" he cried, holding out both his hands to the man who had worked this wonder. "Stay with me, and I will heap on you riches greater than you've ever dreamed of." But the doctor said he would accept nothing more than he had been agreed on, and must return at once to his own country, where many sick people were awaiting him. So King Bellicin had to content himself with ordering the physician to be treated with royal honors, and desiring that an escort should attend to him in his journey home. Well, for 2 years everything went smoothly at court, and King Bellicin and his daughter, the sun no sooner rose than it seemed for it to set. Now, the king's birthday fell in the month of June, and as weather happened to be unusually fine, he told the princess to celebrate it in any way that pleased her. Back to the princess. Diamantina was very fond of being on the river, and she was delighted at this chance of delighting her. Taste. That's just bad writing. She would have a merrymaking such as never had been seen before, and in the evening, when they were tired of sailing and rowing, there should be music and dancing, plays and fireworks. At the very end, before the people went home, every poor person should be given a loaf of bread, and every girl who is to be married within a year a new dress. That's a hell of a party. The great day appeared to Diamantina to be long in coming, But, like other days, it came at last. Before the sun was fairly up in the heavens, the princess, too full of excitement to stay in the palace, was walking about the streets so covered with precious stones that you had to shade your eyes before you could even look at her. By and by, a trumpet sounded, and she hurried home, only to appear again in a few minutes, walking beside her father down to the river. Here a splendid barge was waiting for them, and from it they watched all sorts of races and feats of swimming and diving. When these were over, the barge proceeded up the river to a field where the dancing and concerts were to take place. And after the prizes had been given away to the winners, and the loaves and dresses were distributed by the princess, they bade farewell to their guests, and turned to step into the barge which was to carry them back to the palace. Then a dreadful thing happened. As the king stepped on board the boat, one of the sandals of the white slipper, which had got loose, caught in a nail that was sticking out, and caused the king to stumble. The pain was great, and unconsciously he turned and shook his foot, so that the sandal gave way, and in a moment the precious shoe was in the river. It had all occurred so quickly that nobody had noticed the loss of the slipper, not even the princess, when the king's cries speedily brought to his side. "What is the matter, dear father?" she asked, but the king could not tell her, and only managed to gasp out, "My shoe! My shoe!" while the sailors stood around staring, thinking that his majesty had suddenly gone mad. Seeing her father's eyes fixed on the stream, Diamantina looked hastily in that direction. There, dancing on the current, was the point of something white, which became more and more distant the longer they watched it. The king could bear the sight no more, and besides, now that the healing ointment from the shoe was removed, the pain in the foot was as bad as ever. He gave a sudden cry, staggered, and fell over the bulwarks into the water. Sploosh! In an instant, the river was covered in bobbing heads, all swimming their fastest toward the king, who had been carried far down by the swift current. At length, one swimmer, stronger than the rest, seized hold of his tunic and drew him back to the bank, where 1,000 eager hands were ready to haul him out. He was carried, unconscious, to the side of his daughter, who had fainted with terror on seeing her father disappear below the surface. And together they were placed in a coach and driven to the palace, where the best doctors in the city were awaiting their arrival. In a few hours the princess was as well as ever, but the pain, the wetting, and the shock of the accidents all told severely on the king, and for 3 days he lay with a high fever. Meanwhile his daughter, herself nearly mad with grief, gave orders that the white slipper should be sought for far and wide, and so it was, and being the cleverest divers could find no trace of it at the bottom of the river. When it became clear that the slipper must be carried out to sea by the current, Diamantina turned her thoughts elsewhere. She sent messengers in search of the doctor who had brought relief to her father, begging him to make another slipper as fast as possible to supply the place of one which was lost. But messengers returned with sad news that the doctor had died some weeks before, and what was worse, his secret had died with him. Rest in peace, Dr. Scholes. In his moment of weakness, this intelligence had such an effect on the king that the physicians feared he would become more ill as before. He could hardly be persuaded to touch food, and all night he lay moaning, partly with pain, and partly over his own folly in having begged the doctor to make him several dozen of the white slippers, so that in case the accidents might always have one to put on. However, by and by he saw that it was no use weeping and wailing, and commanded that they should search for his lost treasure more diligently than ever. What a sight the river banks pressed in those days! It seemed as if all the people in the country were gathered on them. But the second search was no more fortunate than the last. And at last the king issued a proclamation that whoever found the missing slipper should be made heir to the crown and should marry the princess. Now, many daughters would have rebelled at being disposed of in such a manner. Fair enough. And it must be admitted that Diamantina's heart sank when she heard that the king had done it. Still, she loved her father so much that she desired his comfort more than anything else in the world, so she said nothing, and only bowed her head. Of course, the result of the proclamation was that the river banks became more crowded than ever, and all the princess's suitors from distant lands flocked to the spot, each hoping that he might find his lucky slipper. Many times the shining stone at the bottom of the stream was taken for the slipper itself, and every evening saw a band of dripping downcast men returning home afterwards. But one youth always lingered longer than the rest, and at night you would still see him engaged in the search, though his clothes stuck to his skin and his teeth chattered. One day, when the king was lying on his bed, racked with pain, he heard the noise of a scuffle going on in his antechamber, and rang a golden bell that stood by his side to summon one of his servants. "Sire," answered the assistant, when the king inquired what was the matter, "the noise you heard was caused by a young man from the town, who has had the impudence to come here to ask if he may measure your Majesty's foot, so as to make another slipper in place of the one you lost." "And what have you done to the youth?" the king said. "The servants pushed him out of the palace, and added a few blows to teach him not to be so insolent," replied the man. "Then they did very ill," answered the king with a frown. "He came here from kindness, and there was no reason to maltreat him." "Oh, my lord, he had the audacity to wish to touch your Majesty's sacred person. He, a good-for-nothing boy, a mere shoemaker's apprentice, perhaps. And even if he could make the shoe to perfection, they would be of no use without the soothing balm." The king remained silent for a few moments, then said, "Never mind. Go and fetch the youth and bring him to me. I would gladly try any remedy that may relieve my pain." Soon afterward, the youth, who had not gone far from the palace, was caught and ushered into the king's presence. He was a tall and handsome young man. Though he professed to make shoes, his manners were good and modest, and he bowed low as he begged the king not to allow him to take the measure of his foot, but also to suffer him a place of healing plaster over the wound. Nelson was pleased with the young man's voice and appearance, and thought that he looked as if he knew what he was doing. So he stretched out his bad foot, which the youth examined with great attention, and then gently laid on the plaster. Very shortly the ointment began to soothe the sharp pain, and the king, whose confidence increased every moment, begged the young man to tell him his name. "I have no parents. They died when I was 6, sire," replied the youth, modestly. "Everyone in town calls me Gilguero, because when I was little I went singing through the world in spite of my misfortunes. Luckily for me, I was born to be happy." "And you really think that you can cure me?" asked the king. "Completely, my lord," answered Gilguero. "How long do you think it will take?" "It is not an easy task, but I will try to finish it in a fortnight." "But," he said, a fortnight seemed to the king to be a long time to make one slipper. But he only said, "Do you need anything to help you?" A good horse, if your majesty will be so kind to give me one, said Gilgiro. And the reply was so unexpected that the courtiers could hardly restrain their smiles, while the king stared silently. You shall have a horse, he said at last, and I shall expect you back in a fortnight. If you fulfill your promise, you know your reward. If not, I will have you flogged for your impudence. Gilgiro bowed and turned to leave the palace, followed by the jeers and scoffs of everyone he met. But he paid no heed, for he had got what he wanted. He waited in front of the gates till the magnificent horse was led up by him, and vaulted into the saddle with an ease which rather surprised the attendant, and rode quickly out of town amidst the jests of the assembled crowd, who had heard his audacious proposal. And while he is on his way, let us pause for a moment and tell you who he is. Now, both his father and mother had died before the boy was 6 years old, and he had lived for many years with his uncle, whose life had been passed in the study of chemistry. He could leave no money for his nephew, and he had a son of his own, but he taught him all he knew, and at his death Gilgiro entered an office where he worked with many hours daily, in his spare time instead of playing with the other boys. He passed hours poring over books, and because he was a little timid and liked to be alone, he was held by everyone to be a little mad. Therefore, when it became known that he had promised to cure the king's foot and had ridden away, no one knew where, a roar of laughter and mockery rang throughout the town, and the jeers and scoffing words were sent after him. But if they had only known what were Gilgiro's thoughts, they would have thought him madder than ever. The real truth was, on the morning when the princess had walked through the streets before making holiday on the river, Giro had seen her from his window, and had straightway fallen in love with her. Of course, he felt quite hopeless, and it was absurd to imagine that the apothecary's nephew would ever marry the king's daughter. So he did his best to forget her and study harder than before, till the royal proclamation suddenly filled him with hope. When he was free, he no longer spent the precious moments poring over books, but, like the rest, he might have been seen wandering along the banks of the river, or driving into the stream, after something glistening in the clear water, which turned out to be a white pebble or a bit of glass. At the end, he understood that it was not by the river that he would win the princess, but by turning to his books for comfort. He studied harder than ever. There is an old proverb that says, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." It is not all men who know how to wait, any more than it is all men who can learn by experience. But Gilgiro was one of the few, instead of thinking of life wasted because he did not have a thing for what he wanted most, he tried to busy himself in other directions. So one day, when he expected it least, his reward would come to him. He happened to be reading a book many hundreds of years old, which told of remedies of all kinds of diseases. Most of them, he knew, were merely invented by old women, who sought to prove themselves wiser than any other people. But at length he came to something which caused him to sit up straight in his chair, and made his eyes brighten. This was the description of the balm, which could cure every kind of sore or wound, distilled from a plant only to be found in a country so distant that it would take a man on foot 2 months to go and come back again. Now, when I say the book declared that the balm could heal every sort of sore or wound, well, there are a few against which it was powerless, and gave certain signs by which these might be known. This was the reason why Guillermo demanded to see the king's foot before he could undertake the cure, and to obtain admittance he gave out that he was a shoemaker. However, the dreaded signs were absent, and his heart bounded with the thought that the princess was within his reach. Perhaps she was, but a great deal had to be accomplished yet, and he had allowed himself a very short time to do it in. He spared his horse only so much as was needed, yet it took him 6 days to reach the spot where the plant grew. A thick wood lay in front of him, and fastened the bridle tightly to a tree. He flung himself on his hands and knees and began to hunt for the treasure. Many times he fancied it was close to him, and many times it turned out to be something else. But at last, when night was fading and he had almost given up hope, he came upon a large bed of the plant, right under his feet. Trembling with joy, he picked every scrap he could see and placed it in his wallet. Then, mounting his horse, he galloped quickly back towards the city. It was night before he entered the gate, and the 15th day allotted were not up until the next day. His eyes were heavy with sleep, and his body ached with the long strain. But without pausing to rest, he kindled a fire on the hearth, and quickly filling a pot with water, he threw the herbs in and left them to boil. After that, he lay down and slept soundly. The sun was shining when he awoke, and he jumped up and ran to the pot. The plant had disappeared, and in its stead was a thick syrup, just as the book said there would be. He lifted the syrup out with a spoon, and after spreading it out in the sun until it was partly dry, he poured it into a small flask of crystal. Then he washed himself thoroughly and dressed himself in his best clothes, and putting the flask in his pocket, set out for the palace and begged to see the king without delay. Now, Ballison, whose foot had been much less painful since Gilguero had wrapped it in the plaster, was counting the days to the young man's return, and when he was told Gilguero was there, ordered him to be admitted at once. As he entered, the king raised himself eagerly on his pillows, but his face fell when he saw no signs of the slipper. "Have you failed, then?" he said, throwing up his hands in despair. "I hope not, your majesty." "I think not," answered the youth, and drawing the flask from his pocket, he poured 2 or 3 drops onto the wound. "Repeat this for 3 nights, and you will find yourself cured," said he, and before the king had time to thank him, he had bowed himself out. Of course, the news soon spread around the city, and men and women were never tired of calling Guillermo an impostore, and prophesying that at the end of the 3 days, they would see him in prison, if not on the scaffold. But Guillermo paid no heed to their hard calls, and no more did the king, who took care that no hand but his own should be put on the healing balm. On the 4th day, the king awoke and instantly stretched out his wounded foot that he might prove the truth or falsehood of Gilguero's remedy. The wound was certainly cured on that side, but how about the other? Yes, it was cured also, and not even a scar was left to show where it had been. Was ever any king so happy as Bowson when he satisfied himself of this? Lightly as a deer, he jumped from the bed and began to turn head over heels and perform all sorts of antics, as if to make sure the foot was in truth as well as it looked. And when he was quite tired, he sent for his daughter and bade the courtiers to bring the lucky young man to his room. "He really is young and handsome," said the princess to herself, heaving a sigh of relief that it was not some dreadful old man who had healed her father, While the king was announcing to his courtiers that his wonderful cure had been made, Diamantina was thinking that Gilguero looked so well in his common dress, how much improved by the splendid garments of a king's son. However, she held her peace, and only watched with amusement when the courtiers, knowing there was no help for it, did homage and obeisance to the chemist's boy. Then they brought Guillermo a magnificent tunic of green velvet bordered in gold, and a cap with 3 white plumes stuck in it, and at the sight of him so arrayed, the princess fell in love with him in a moment. The wedding was fixed to take place in 8 days, and at the ball afterwards, nobody danced so long or as lightly as King Bellison. But you know Dr. Schultz was in fairy tales. Really, he made a cast. But still. Our next story. He wins. Let me try this again without the weirdness. He wins who waits. From the Olive Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there reigned a king who had an only daughter. The girl had been spoiled by everyone from her birth, and besides being beautiful and clever and witty, and when she grew old enough to be married, she refused to have anything to say to the prince whom her father favored, but declared that she would choose a husband for herself. By long experience, the king knew that once she had made up her mind, there was no expecting her to change it. So he inquired meekly what she wished him to do. "Summon all the young men in the kingdom to appear before me a month from today," answered the princess, "and the one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband." "But, my dear," began the king in tones of dismay. "The one to whom I shall give this golden apple to shall be my husband," repeated the princess, in a louder voice than before. The king understood that signal, and with a high sigh proceeded to do her bidding. The young men arrived, tall and short, dark and fair, rich and poor. They stood in rows in great courtyards in front of the palace, and the princess, clad in robes of green with golden veil flowing behind her, passed before them all, holding the apple. Once or twice she stopped and hesitated, but in the end she always passed on, till she came to a youth near the end of the last row. There was nothing especially remarkable about him, the bystanders thought, nothing that was likely to take a girl's fancy. 100 others were handsomer, and all wore finer clothes, but he met the princess's eyes frankly and with a smile, and she smiled too, and held out the apple. "There's some mistake," cried the king, who had anxiously watched her progress, and hoped that none of the candidates would please her. "It is impossible that she should wish to marry the son of a poor widow, who has not a farthing in the world. Tell her that I will not hear of it, and that she must go through the rows again and fix upon someone else." And the princess went through the rows a second and a third time, and on each occasion she gave the apple to the widow's son. "Well, marry him if you will," exclaimed the angry king, "but at least you shall not stay here." And the princess answered nothing, but threw up her head, and taking the widow's son by the hand, they left the castle. That evening they were married, and after the ceremony went back to the house of the bridegroom's mother, which, in the eyes of the princess, did not look much bigger than a hen coop. As if we were not poor enough before, grumbled she. I dare say this is some fine lady who can do nothing to earn her living. But the princess stroked her arm and said softly, Do not be vexed, dear mother. I am a famous spinner, and I can sit at my wheel all day without breaking a thread. And she kept her word. But in spite of her efforts of all three, they became poorer and poorer. And at the end of 6 months, it was agreed that the husband should go to a neighboring town to get work. Here, he met a merchant who was about to start a long journey with a train of camels laden with goods of all sorts, and needed a man to help him. The widow's son begged that he would take him as a servant, and to this merchant assented, giving him the whole year's salary beforehand. The young man returned home with the news, and the next day bade farewell to his mother and his wife, who were very sad at seeing him part. Do not forget me while you are absent, whispered the princess as she flung her arms round his neck, and you shall pass by the well which lies near the city gate and stop and greet the old man you will find sitting there. Kiss his hand and then ask him what counsel he can give you for your journey. Then the youth set out, and when he reached the well where the old man was sitting, he asked the questions his wife had bidden him. My son, replied the old man, you have done well to come to me, and in return remember three things. She whom the heart loves is ever the most beautiful. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. He wins who waits. The young man thanked him and went on his way. The next morning, early the caravan set out, and before sunset it had arrived at the first halting place, some round wells where another company of merchants had already encamped. But no rain had fallen in a long time in that rocky country, and both men and beasts were parched with thirst. To be sure, there was another well about half a mile away, where there was always water, but to get to it, it had to be lowered deep down, and besides, no one who had ever descended that well had been known to come back. However, till they could store some water in their bags of goatskin, the caravans dared not go further into the desert. And on the night of the arrival of the widow's son and his masters, the merchants had decided to offer a large reward to anyone who was brave enough to go down into the enchanted well and bring some up. Thus it happened that at sunrise the young man was aroused from his sleep by a herald marking his round of the camps, proclaiming that every merchant present should give 1,000 pastries to the man who would risk his life to bring water for themselves and their camels. Well, the youth hesitated a little when he heard this proclamation. The story of the well had spread far and wide, and not long ago had reached his ears. The danger was great, he knew, but, well, if he came back alive, he would be the possessor of 80,000 piastres. He turned to the herald who was passing the tent. I'll go. What madness! Cried his master, who happened to be standing near. You are too young to throw away your life like that. Run after the herald and tell him that you take back your offer. But the young man shook his head, and the merchant saw that it was useless to try to persuade him. Well, it is your own affair, he observed at last. If you must go, you must. Only, if you never return, I will give your camel's load of goods and my best mule besides. and touching his turban in token of farewell, he entered his tent. Hardly had he done so that the crowd of men were seen pouring out of the camp. "How can we thank you?" they exclaimed, pressing round the youth. "Our camels, as well as ourselves, are almost dead of thirst. See, here is the rope we have brought to let you down." "Come then," answered the youth, and they all set out. On reaching the well, the rope was knotted securely under his arms. A big goatskin bottle was given him, and he was gently lowered to the bottom of the pit. Here a clear stream was bubbling over the rocks, and stooping down, he was about to drink, when a huge Arab appeared before him, saying in a loud voice, "Come with me!" The young man rose, never doubting that this was his last hour, but he could do nothing. They followed the Arab into a brilliantly lighted hall on the further side of the little river. There his guide sat down, and drawing towards him two boys, he said to the stranger, "I have a question for you to ask. If you answer it right, your life shall be spared. If not, your head will be forfeit, as many others have done before you. Tell me, which of my two children is the handsomer?" The question did not seem hard, for while one boy was as beautiful as any child had ever been, his brother was ugly. But just as the youth was going to speak, the old man's counsel flashed into the youth's mind, and he replied hastily, "The one whom we love best is always the handsomest." "You have saved me!" cried the Arab, rising quickly from his seat and pressing the young man in his arms. "Ah, if you could only guess what I have suffered from the stupidity of all the people whom I have put the question to, and I was condemned by a wicked genius to remain until all was answered. But what you brought to this place, and how I can reward you for what you have done for me." "By helping me draw enough water for my caravan of 80 merchants and their camels, who are dying of want from it," replied the youth. "Consider it done," said the Arab. "Take these 3 apples, and when you have filled your skin and are ready to be drawn up, lay one of them on the ground. Halfway to the earth, let another fall, and at the top, drop the third. If you follow my directions, no harm will happen to you. And take these besides, these 3 pomegranates, green, red, and white. One day you will find use for them." The young man did as he was told, and stepped out of the rocky waste, where the merchants were anxiously awaiting him. Oh, how thirsty they all were! But even after the camels had drunk, the skins seemed full as ever. Full of gratitude for the deliverance, the merchants pressed the money into his hands, while his own master bade him choose what goods he liked, and a mule to carry them. So the widow's son was rich at last, and when the merchant had sold his merchandise and returned home to his native city, the servant hired a man by whom he sent the money and the mule back to his wife. "I will send the pomegranates also," he thought, "for if I leave them in my turban they may fall out some day." And he drew them out of his turban, but the fruit had vanished, and in their places were 3 precious stones, green, white, and red. For a long time he remained with the merchant, who gradually trusted him with all his business, and gave him a large share of the money he made. When his master died, the young man wished to return home, but the widow begged him to stay and help her. And one day he awoke with a start to remember that 20 years had passed since he had gone away. "I want to see my wife," he said the next morning to his mistress. "If any time I can use of you, send a messenger to me. Meanwhile, I have told Hassan what to do." And, mounting a camel, he set out. Now, Soon after he had taken service of the merchant, a little boy had been born to him. Both the princess and the old woman toiled hard all day to get the baby food and clothing. When the money and the pomegranates arrived, there was no need for them to work any more, and the princess saw at once that they were not food at all, but precious stones of great value. The old woman, however, not being accustomed, like her daughter-in-law, to the sight of jewels, took them only as common fruit. Let's just and wished to give them to the child to eat. She was very angry when the princess hastily took them from her and hid them in her dress. While she went to the market and bought the finest pomegranates she could find, she handed the old woman for the little boy. Then she bought beautiful new clothes for them all, and when they dressed, they looked as fine as they could be. Next, she took out one of the precious stones which her husband had sent to her, and placed it in a small silver box. This she wrapped up in a handkerchief embroidered with gold, and filled the old woman's pockets with gold and silver pieces. "Go, dear mother," she said, "to the palace, and present the jewel to the king, and if he asks you what you can give him in return, tell him that you want a paper, with his seal attached, proclaiming that no one is to meddle with anything you may choose to do. Before you leave the palace, distribute the money among the servants." The old woman took the box and started for the palace. No one there had ever seen a ruby of such beauty, and the most famous jeweler in town was summoned to declare its value. All he could say was, "If a boy threw a stone into the air with all his might, and you could pile up as much gold as high as the flat of the stone, it would not be sufficient to pay for this ruby." Wow. At these words, the king's face fell. Having once seen the ruby, he could not bear to part with it, yet all the money in his treasury would not be enough to buy it. So, for the little while, he remained silent, wondering what offer he could do to make the old woman. "If I cannot give you its worth in money, is there anything you will take in exchange?" "A paper signed by your hand and sealed with your seal, proclaiming that I may do what I will, without let or hindrance," she answered promptly. And the king, delighted to have obtained what he coveted at such a small cost, gave her the paper without delay. Then the old woman took her leave and returned home. The fame of this wonderful ruby soon spread far and wide, and envoys arrived at the little house to know if there were more stones to sell. Each king was so anxious to gain possession of the treasure that he bade his messenger outbid the rest, and so the princess sold the two remaining stones for a large sum of money. That the pieces of gold had been spread out, they would have reached from here to the moon. The first thing she did was to build a palace by the side of the cottage, and it was raised on pillars of gold, in which were set great diamonds, which blazed night and day. Of course, the news of the palace was the first thing that reached the king of her father on his return from the wars, and he hurried to see it. In the doorway stood a young man of 20, who was his grandson, though neither of them knew it. And so pleased was the king with the appearance of the youth that he carried him back to his own palace and made him commander of the whole army. That's not how it works. Not long after this, the widow's son returned to his native land. There, sure enough, was the tiny cottage where he had lived with his mother, but the gorgeous building beside it was quite new to him. What had become of his wife and his mother, and who could be dwelling in that wonderful place? These were the first thoughts that flashed through his mind, but not wishing to betray himself by asking questions of passing strangers, he climbed up into a tree that stood opposite the palace and watched. By and by, a lady came out and began to gather some of the roses and jessamine that hung on the porch. The 20 years that had passed since he had last beheld her vanished in an instant, and he knew her to be his own wife, looking almost as beautiful and young as on the day of their parting. He was about to jump out of the tree and hasten by her side when she was joined by a young man who placed his arm around her affectionately around the neck. At this sight, the angry husband drew his bow, and before he could let the arrow fly, the counsel of the wise man came back to him. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. And he laid that down again. At this moment the princess turned, and seeing her companion's head down to hers, kissing him on the cheek, a second blind rage filled the heart of the watcher, and he snatched up his bow of the branch where it had hung, when words long heard ago seemed to sound in his ears. He who waits, he wins who waits. I'm never going to say that right. And the bow dropped by his side, and then through the silent air came the sound of a youth's voice. Mother, can you tell me nothing about my father? Does he still live, and will he ever return to us? Alas, my son, how can I answer you? Replied the lady. 20 years have passed since he left us to make his fortune, and in that time only once have I heard of him. But what has brought him to your mind just now? Because last night I dreamed that he was here, said the youth, and then I remembered what I had long forgotten, that I had a father, even though his very history is strange to me. And now, tell me, I pray you, all you can concerning him. And standing under Jessamine, the son learned of his father's history, and the man and the tree listened also. Oh, exclaimed the youth when it was ended, while he twisted his hands in pain. I'm general in chief, and you're the king's daughter, and we have the most splendid palace in the world, and yet my father lives we know not where, and for all we can guess, may be poor and miserable. Tomorrow I will ask the king to give me soldiers, and I will seek him over the whole earth until I find him. Then the man came down from the tree, and clasped his wife and son in his arms. All that night they talked, and when the sun rose it still found them talking. But as soon as it was proper, he went to the palace to pay his homage to the king, and to inform him of all that had happened, and who they really all were. The king was overjoyed to think that his daughter, whom he had long since forgiven and sorely missed, was living at his gates, and was, beside, the mother of the youth who was so dear to him. It was written beforehand, cried the monarch. You are my son-in-law before the world, and shall be king after me. And the Mao bowed his head. He had waited, and he had won. Excuse me. That was a very interesting story, actually. I don't think I've read that one before. Hey, it can happen. Excuse me. Our next story. The Three Snake Leaves from the Green Fairy book. There once was a man who was poor, who could no longer afford to keep his only son at home. So the son said to him, Dear father, you are so poor that I am only a burden to you. I'd rather go out into the world and see if I can earn my own living. The father gave him his blessing and took leave of him with much sorrow. About this time, the king of a very powerful kingdom was carrying on a war, and the youth therefore took service under him and went on the campaign. When they came before the enemy, battle took place. There was some hot fighting, and it rained bullets so thickly that his comrades fell around him on all sides. And when their leader fell too, the rest wished to take flight. But the youth stepped forward and encouraged them and called out, "We must not let our country be ruined." Then others followed him, and he pressed on to defeat the enemy. When the king heard that, he had to thank him alone for the victory. He raised him higher than anyone else in rank, and gave him great treasures, and made him the first in the kingdom. The king had a daughter who was very beautiful, but she was also very capricious. She had made a vow to marry no one who would not promise her that if she died first, he would allow himself to be buried alive with her. "If he truly loves me," she used to say, "what use would life be to him then?" At the same time, she was willing to do the same, and if he died first, to be buried with him. This curious vow had up to this time frightened away all suitors, but the young man was so captivated by her beauty that he hesitated at nothing and asked her hand of, of her father. You know," asked the king, "what you have promised." "I shall have to go to the grave with her," he answered, "if I outlive her, but my love is so great that I do not think that the risk." So the king consented, and the wedding was celebrated with great splendor. Now, they lived for a long time very happily with one another. But then it came to pass that the young queen fell seriously ill, and no doctor could save her. And when she lay dead, the young king remembered what he had promised, and it made him shudder to think of lying in her grave alive. But there was no escape. The king had set guards before all the gates, and it was not possible to avoid his fate. When the day arrived on which the corpse was to be laid in the royal vault, he was led there. Then at the entrance it was bolted and closed up. And near the coffin stood a table on which were placed 4 candles, 4 loaves of bread, and 4 bottles of wine. As soon as the provisions came to an end, he would have to die. So he sat there full of grief and misery, eating every day only a tiny bit of bread, and drinking only a mouthful of wine, as he watched death creeping nearer and nearer to him. One day, as he was sitting staring moodily in front of him, he saw a snake creep out of the corner towards the corpse. Thinking it was going to touch it, he drew his sword, saying, "As long as I live, you shall not harm her." He cut it in 3 pieces. After a little time, a second snake crept out of the corner, and when it saw the first one lying dead in pieces, it went back and came again soon, holding 3 green leaves in its mouth. Then it took the 3 bits of the snake and laid them in order, and put one of the leaves on each wound. Immediately after, the pieces joined together, and the snake moved itself and became alive, and then both hurried away. The leaves remained on the ground, and it suddenly occurred to the unfortunate man who had seen everything that the wonderful power of the leaves might also be exercised on a human being. So he picked up the leaves and laid them one on the mouth, the other 2 on the eyes of the dead woman. And scarcely had he done this before the blood began to circulate in her veins. Then it mounted, and he brought color back to her white face. Then she drew her breath, opened her eyes, and said, "Ah, where am I?" "You're with me, dear lady," he answered, and told her all that had happened. and how he had brought her to life again. Then he gave her some wine and bread, and when all her strength had returned, she got up, and they went to the door, and knocked and called so loudly that the guards could hear him. And they told the king. The king himself came to open the door, and there he found both happy and well, and he rejoiced with them that now all trouble was over. But the young king gave the 3 snake leaves to a servant, saying to him, "Keep them carefully for me, and always carry them with you. Who knows but they may help us in a time of need?" It seemed, however, as if a change had come to the young queen after she had been restored to life, as if all her love for her husband had faded from her heart. Some time afterwards he waited to take a journey over the sea to see his old father, and they were on board the ship. She forgot the great love and fearlessness he had shown her, and how he had saved her from death, and fell in love with the captain. And one day, when the young king was lying asleep, she called the captain to her, and seized the head of the sleeping king, and made him take his feet, and together they threw him into the sea. When they had done this wicked deed, she said to him, "Now let us go home, and say that he died on the journey. I will praise you so much to my father that he will marry me to you, and make you the heir to the throne." But the faithful servant, who had seen everything, let down a little boat into the sea, unobserved them, and rowed after his master while the traders sailed on. He took the drowned man out of the water, and with the help of 3 sea snake leaves, which he carried with him, placing them on his mouth and eyes, he brought him to life again. They both rowed as hard as they could, night and day, and their little boat went so quickly that they reached the old king before the other 2 had. He was much astonished to see them come back alone, and he asked what had happened to them. When he heard the wickedness of his daughter, he said, "I cannot believe that she acted so wrongly, but the truth will soon come out." He made them both go into a secret chamber, and let no one see them. Soon after this, a large ship came in, and the wicked lady appeared before her father with a face very sad. He said to her, "Why have you come back alone? Where is your husband?" "Ah, dear father," she replied, "I've come home in great grief. My husband fell ill on the voyage quite suddenly and died, and if the good captain had not given me help, I should have died too. He was at his deathbed, and can tell you everything." The king said, "I will bring the dead to life again." And he opened the door to the room and called them both out. The lady was thunderstruck when she caught sight of her husband, and fell on her knees and begged for mercy. But the king said, "You shall have no mercy. He was ready to die with you and restored you to life again, but you killed him when he was sleeping, and shall not receive your deserts." So she and her accomplice were put in a ship, which was bored through with holes, and were drawn out into the sea, where they soon perished by the waves. Okay, just the line of "you shall receive your deserts." "You shall receive your deserts for killing your husband." No dessert for you. Anywho, take another drink. Excuse me again. Dragon Fruit Gamer Subs. Not sponsored. Our next story. The Story of the 7 Simons, from the Crimson Fairy Book. Far, far away, beyond all sorts of countries, seas, and rivers, there stood a splendid city where lived King Archetti, who was as good as he was rich and handsome. He owned 40 times 40 cities, and in each city he had 10 palaces with silver doors, golden roofs, and crystal windows. His council consisted of 12 wisest men in the country, whose long beards flowed over their breasts, each of whom was learned as a whole college. This council always told the king the exact truth. Now the king had everything to make him happy, but he did not enjoy anything because he could not find a bride to his mind. One day, as he sat in the palace looking out to sea, a great ship sailed into the harbor, and several merchants came on shore. Said the king to himself, "These people have traveled far and beheld many lands. I will ask them if they have seen any princess as clever and as handsome as I am." Easiest. So he ordered the merchants to be brought before him, and when they came, he said, "You have traveled much and visited many wonders. I wish to ask you a question. Who, and I beg you to answer truthfully, have you anywhere seen or heard of the daughter of an emperor, king, or a prince who is as clever and as handsome as I am, and who would be worthy to be my wife and the queen of my country?" The merchants considered for some time. At last the eldest of them said, "I've heard that across many seas is an island of Busan, where a mighty king whose daughter, the Princess Helena, is so lovely that she can certainly be no plainer than your majesty, and so clever that the wisest greybeard cannot guess her riddles." "Is the island far off, and which way to it?" "It is not near," was the answer. "The journey would take 10 years, and we do not know the way. And even if we did, what use would that be? The princess is no bride for you." "How dare you say so?" cried the king angrily. "Your majesty must pardon us, but just think for a moment. Should you send an envoy to the island, he will take 10 years to get there and 10 years to return. 20 years in all. Will the princess not have grown old in that time and have lost all her beauty?" The king reflected gravely. Then he thanked the merchants, and gave them leave to trade in his country without paying any duties, and dismissed them. After they were gone, the king remained deep in thought. He felt puzzled and anxious, so decided to ride into the country to distract his mind, and sent for his huntsmen and falconers. The huntsmen blew their horns, and the falconers took their hawks on their wrists, and off they set across the country till they came to a great hedge. On the other side of the hedge stretched a great field of maize as far as the eye could reach, and the yellow ears swayed to and fro in the gentle breeze like rippling sea of gold. Yeah. The king drew his rein and admired the field. "Upon my word," said he, "whoever dug and planted it must be a good workman. If all the fields in my kingdom were as well cared for as this, there would be more bread than any country to eat." And he wished to know to whom the field belonged. Off rushed all his followers at once to do his bidding, and found a nice, tidy farmhouse, in front of which sat 7 peasants, lunching on rye bread and drinking water. They wore red shirts with gold braid, and they were so much alike that one could hardly tell one from the other. The messengers asked, Who owns the fields of golden maize? The 7 brothers answered. The field is ours. And who are you? We're King Archid's laborers. These answers were repeated to the king, who ordered the brothers to be brought before him at once. On being asked who they were, the eldest bowed low and said, We, King Archided, are your laborers, children of one father and mother, and we all have the same name, for each of us is called Simon. Our father taught us to be true to our king, and to till the ground, and to be kind to our neighbors. He also taught us each a different trade that he thought might be useful to us, and he bade us not to neglect our Mother Earth, which would be sure to amply reply our labor. Yes, be good to Mother Earth. The king was pleased with an honest peasant, and said, You have done good people, in planting your field, and now you have a golden harvest. But I should like to ask each of you to tell me your special trades your father taught you. My trade, O king, said the first Simon, is not an easy one. If you will give me some workmen and some materials, I will build you a great white pillar that shall reach above the clouds. Very good, replied the king. And you, Simon the Second, what is your trade? Mine, your majesty, needs no great cleverness. When my brother has built a pillar, I can mount it, and from the top, as far as the clouds, I can tell you what is happening in every country under the sun. Good, said the king. And Simon the Third? My work is very simple, sire. You have many ships built by learned men, with all sorts of new and clever improvements. If you wish, I will build you quite a simple boat. 1, 2, 3, and it's done. But my plain little homemade ship is not grand enough for a king. Where other ships take a year, mine can make the voyage in a day. And where there would require 10 years, mine will go the distance in a week. Good, said the king again. And what has Simon the Fourth learned? My trade, O king, is really of no importance. Should my brother build you a ship and let it embark in it, if we should be pursued by an enemy, I can seize our boat by the prow and sink it to the bottom of the sea. When the enemy has sailed off, I can draw it up again to the top. That is very clever of you, answered the king. And what does Simon the Fifth do? My work, your majesty, is mere smith's work. Order me to build a smithy, and I will make you a crossbow. But from which neither the eagle in the sky nor the wild beast of the forest is safe. The bolt hits whatever the eye sees. That sounds very useful, said the king. And now, Simon the Sixth, tell me of your trade. Sorry, it is so simple I'm almost ashamed to mention it. If my brother hits any creature, I can catch it quicker than any dog can. If it falls into the water, I can pick it up with the greatest depth, and if in the forest dark, I can find it even at midnight. The king was much pleased at the trades and talk of the 6 brothers, and said, Thank you, good people. Your father did well to teach you all these things. Now follow me into the town, and I want to see what you can do. I need such people as you around me, and when the harvest comes, I will send you home with royal presents. The brothers bowed and said, As the king wills. Suddenly the king remembered that he had not questioned the 7th Simon, so he turned to him and said, Why are you silent? What is your handicraft? The 7th Simon answered, I have no handicraft, O king. I have learned nothing. I could not manage it. And if I do know anything, it is not what might properly be called, real trade. It's rather sort of a performance, but it's one of no one, not even the king himself, must watch me doing. And I doubt whether the performance of mine would please your majesty. Come, come, cried the king. I will have no excuses. What is this trade?
First, sire, give me your royal word that you will not kill me when I have told you. Then you shall hear.
So be it then. I give you my royal word.
Then the seventh Simon stepped back a little, cleared his throat, and said, My trade, King Archedge, is of such kind that the man who follows it in your kingdom generally loses his life and has no hope for pardon. There's only one thing I can really do well, and that is steal and to hide the smallest scrap of anything I've stolen. Not the deepest vault, even if its lock were enchanted, could prevent my stealing anything from it that I wish to have. When the king heard this, he fell into a passion.
I will not pardon you, you rascal, cried. I will shut you up in my deepest dungeon on bread and water till you have forgiven such a trade. Indeed, it would be better to have you put to death at once. I have a good mind to do so.
Don't kill me, O king. I'm really not as bad as you think. Why, had I chosen, I would have robbed the royal treasury, or bribed your judges to let me off, and built a white marble palace with what was left. But, though I know how to steal, I don't do it. You yourself asked me my trade. If you kill me, you will break your own royal word.
Point Simon. Very well, said the king. I will not kill you. I pardon you. But from this hour you shall be shut up in a dark dungeon. Here, guards, away with him to the prison. But you 6 Simons follow me and be assured of my royal favor.
So, the 6 Simons followed the king. The 7th Simon was seized by the guards, who put him in chains and threw him in prison, with only bread and water for food. The next day the king gave the first Simon carpenters, masons, and smiths, and laborers, with great stores of iron, mortar, and the like. The Simon began to build. He built his great white pillar far, far up into the clouds, as high as the nearest stars. But the other stars were higher still. Then the second Simon climbed up the pillar and saw and heard all that was going on in the whole world. When he came down, he had all sorts of wonderful things to tell. How one king was marching a battle against another, and which was likely to be the victor. How in another place great rejoicings were going on, while in a third people were dying of famine. In fact, there was not the smallest event going on over the world that was hidden from him. Next, the third Simon began. He stretched out his arms once, twice, and thrice, and the wonder ship was ready. At a sign from the king, it was launched and proudly floated safely like a bird on the waves. Instead of ropes, it had wires for rigging, and musicians played on them with fiddle bows and made lovely music. While the ship swam about, the fourth Simon seized the prow with a strong hand, and in a moment it was gone, sunk to the bottom of the sea. An hour passed, and then the ship floated again, drawn by Simon's left hand, while his right he again brought a gigantic fish from the depths of the ocean for the royal table. While this was going on, the fifth Simon had built his forge and hammered out his iron, and when the king returned from the harbor, the magic crossbow was made. His Majesty went out to an open field at once, and looked up into the sky, and saw far, far away an eagle flying towards the sun, and looking like a little speck.
Now, said the king, if you can shoot that bird, I will reward you.
Simon only smiled, lifted his crossbow, took aim, and fired, and the eagle fell. As it was falling, the sixth Simon ran with a dish, caught the bird before it fell to the earth, and brought it to the king.
Many thanks, my brave lads, said the king. I see that each of you is indeed the master of his trade. You shall be richly rewarded. But now rest and have your dinner.
The 6 Simons bowed and went to dinner. But they had hardly begun before the messenger came to say the king wanted to see them. They obeyed at once and found him surrounded by his court and men of state. "Listen, my good fellows," cried the king as soon as he saw them. "Hear what my wise counsellors have thought of you. As you, Simon II, can see the whole world from the top of the great pillar, I want you to climb up to see and hear. For I am told that far away, across many seas, is the great kingdom of the island of Busan, and that the daughter of the king is the beautiful Princess Helena." Off ran the second Simon and clambered quickly up the pillar. He gazed around and listened on all sides, then slid down to report to the king. "Sir, I have obeyed your orders, and far away in the island of Busan the king has a mighty monarch who is full of pride, harsh and cruel. He sits on the throne and declares that no prince or king on earth is good enough for his lovely daughter, that he would give her to none, and that if any king were to ask for a favor, he will declare war against him and destroy his kingdom." "Has the king of Busan a great army?" asked King Arches. "Is his country far off?" "As far off as I could judge," replied Simon. "It would take you nearly 10 years in fair weather to sail there. But if the weather were stormy, it might be closer to 12. I saw an army being reviewed. It is not very large, 100,000 men-at-arms, and 100,000 knights. Besides, then, he has a strong bodyguard and a good many crossbowmen. Altogether, you may say another 100, or it's picked up a body of heroes just in reserves for the special occasions that might require particular courage." The king sat for some time, lost in thought. At last he said to the nobles and the courtiers standing round, "I am determined to marry the Princess Helena, but how shall I do it?" The nobles and courtiers and councillors said nothing, but tried to hide behind each other. Then the third Simon said, "Pardon me, your majesty, if I may offer my advice. You wish to go to the island of Busan. What can be easier? In my ship you will get there in a week instead of 10 years. But ask your council to advise you on what to do when you arrive. In one word, whether you will win the princess peacefully or by war." But the wise men were silent as ever. The king frowned and was about to say something sharp when the court fool pushed his way to the front and said, "Dear me, what are all you clever people so puzzled about? The matter's quite clear. It seems it will not take long to reach the island. Why not send the seventh Simon? He will steal the fair maiden fast enough, and then the king, her father, may consider how to be going about bringing his army over here. It will take him 10 years to do so, no less. What do you think of my plan?" "What do I think? Why, that your idea is capital, and you shall be rewarded for it. Come, guards, hurry as fast as you can, and bring the seventh Simon before me." Not many minutes later, Simon the Seventh stood before the king, who explained to him what he wished done, and also to steal for the benefit of the king and country was by no means a wrong thing, though it was very wrong to steal for his own advantage. The youngest Simon, who looked very pale and hungry, only nodded his head. "Come," said the king, "tell me truly, do you think you could steal the Princess Helena?" "Hey, Doc, thanks for looking." "Why should I not steal her, sire? The thing is easy enough. Let my brother's ship be laden with rich stuffs, brocades, Persian carpets, pearls, and jewels. Send me on the ship, and give me my 4 middle brothers for companions, and keep the 2 others as hostages." When the king heard these words, his heart became filled with longing, and he ordered all to be done as Simon wished. Everyone ran about to do his bidding, and in the next to no time, the wonder ship was laden and ready to start. These 5 Simons took leave of the king, went on board, and had no sooner set sail than they were almost out of sight. The ship cut through the waters like a falcon through the air, and just a week after starting sighted the island of Busan. The coast appeared to be strongly guarded, and from far away the watchman on a high tower called out, "Halt and anchor! Who are you? Where do you come from? And what do you want?" The seventh Simon answered from the ship, "We are peaceful people. We come to the country for the good and great King Archidej, and we bring foreign wares, rich brocades, carpets, costly jewels, which we wish to show your king and the princess. We desire to trade, to sell, and to buy in exchange." The brothers launched a small boat, took some of their valuable goods with them, rowed to shore, and went up to the palace. The princess sat in a rose-red room, and when she saw the brothers coming near, she called her nurse and other women, and told them to inquire who and what these people were, and what they wanted. The seventh Simon answered the nurse, "We come from a country of the wise and good King Architej," he said, "and we have brought all sorts of goods for sale. We trust the king of this country may condescend to welcome us, and to let us take charge of our wares. If he considers them worthy to adorn his followers, we shall be content." His speech was repeated to the princess, who ordered the brothers to be brought to the rose-red room at once. They bowed respectfully to her, and displayed some splendid velvets and brocades, and opened the cases of pearls and precious stones. Such beautiful things had never been seen on the island, and the nurse and the waiting woman were standing bewildered by the magnificence. They whispered together that they had never beheld anything like it. The princess, too, saw and wondered, and her eyes were not weary at looking at the lovely things, or her fingers of stroking the soft, rich stuffs, and of holding up the sparkling jewels to the light. "Fairest of princesses," said Simon, "be pleased to order your waiting maids to accept the silks and brocades and velvets, and let your women turn their head dresses with the jewels. They are no special treasures, but permit me to say that they are nothing to be the colored tapestries, the gorgeous stones, and the ropes of pearls on our ship. We did not like to bring more with us, not knowing what a royal taste might be. But if it seems good to you to honor our ship as a visit, you might condescend to choose such things as you were pleasing to your eyes." This polite speech pleased the princess very much. She went to the king and said, "Dear father, some merchants have arrived with the most splendid wares. Pray allow me to go to their ship and choose out what I like." The king thought and thought, frowned hard, and rubbed his ear. At last he gave consent, and ordered out his royal yacht with 100 crossbows, 1,000 knights, and 1,000 soldiers to escort Princess Helena. Off sailed the yacht with the princess and her escort. The brother Simon came on board to conduct the princess to their ship, and led by the brothers and followed her by her nurse and other women. She crossed the crystal plank from one vessel to another. The seventh Simon spread out his goods, and had so many curious and interesting tales to tell them that the princess forgot everything else in looking and listening, so that she did not know that the fourth Simon had seized the prow of the ship, and that all of a sudden it had vanished from sight and was racing along the depths of the ocean. The crew of the royal yacht shouted aloud. The knights stood still with their terror. The soldiers were dumbstruck and hung their heads. There was nothing to be done but sail back and tell the king of his loss. Oh, how he wept and stormed. "Oh, Lord of my lights," he sobbed, "I am indeed punished for my pride. I thought no one good enough might be your poor husband, and now you are lost in the depths of the sea, and have me left alone. As for you, of all you saw this thing, away with you. Let them be put in irons and lock them in prison, whilst I think how I can best be put them to death." Whilst the king of Busan was raging and lamenting in this fashion, Simon's ship was swimming like a fish under the sea, and while the island was well out of sight, he brought it up to the surface again, and that moment the princess recollected herself. "Yes," she said, "we have been gazing at these wonders only for too long. I hope my father won't be vexed at our delay." She tore herself away and stepped on deck. Neither the yacht nor the island was in sight. Helena wrung her hands and beat her breast. Then she changed herself into a white swan and flew off. But the fifth Simon seized his bow and shot the swan, and the sixth Simon did not let her fall into the water, but caught it in the ship, and the swan turned into a silver fish. But Simon lost no time and caught the fish. Then, quick as thought, the fish turned into a black mouse and ran about the ship. It darted towards a hole, but before it could reach it, Simon sprang upon it more swiftly than any cat. And then the little mouse turned once more into the beautiful Princess Helena. Early one morning, King Archibald sat thoughtfully at the window gazing out to sea. His heart was sad, and he would neither eat nor drink. His thoughts were full of the Princess Helena, who he had yet to actually see, who was as lovely as a dream. Is that white gull he sees flying towards the shore, or is it a sail? No, it is a gull. It is a wonder ship flying along, with glowing sails. The flags wave, the fiddlers play, and the wire rigging, the anchor is thrown out, and the crystal plank laid from ship to pier. The lovely Helena steps across the plank. She shines like the sun, and the stars in heaven seem to sparkle in her eyes. Up sprang King Archidej in haste. "Hurry, hurry!" he cried. "Let us hasten to meet her. Let the bugles sound and the joy bells ring." And the whole court swarmed with courtiers and servants. Golden carpets were laid down, and the great gates thrown open to welcome the princess. King Archidej went out himself, took her by the hand, and led her into the royal apartments. "Madam," he said, "the fame of your beauty has reached me, but I had not dared to expect such loveliness. Still, I would not keep you here against your will. If you wish it, the wonder ship will take you back to your father and your own country. But if you will consent to stay here, then reign over me and my country as our queen." Reign over me. What more is there to tell? It's not hard to guess that the princess listened to the king's wooing, and their betrothal took place in a great pomp and rejoicing. The brothers Simon were sent again to the island of Busan with letters to the king for his daughter to invite him to their wedding. And the wonder ship arrived at the island of Busan just as all the knights and soldiers who had escorted the princess were being led to their executions. The seventh Simon cried out from the ship, "Stop! Stop! We bring a letter from Princess Helena." The king of Busan read the letter over and over again, and ordered the knights and soldiers to be set free. He entertained King Archidej's ambassadors hospitably, and sent his blessing to his daughter, but he could not be brought to attend the wedding. When the wonder ship got home, King Archidej and Princess Helena were enchanted with the news it brought. The king sent for the seven Simons. "A thousand thanks to you, my brave fellows," he cried. "Take what gold, silver, and precious stones you will out of my treasury. Tell me if there's anything else you wish for, and I will give it to you, my good friends. Do you wish to be made nobles, or to govern towns? Only speak." The eldest Simon bowed and said, "We are plain folk, your majesty, and understand simple things best. What figures should be cut as nobles or governors? Nor do we desire gold. We have our fields which give us food, and as much money as we need. If you wish to reward us, then grant that our land be free of taxes. And your goodness pardon the seventh Simon. He is not the first who has been thief by trade, and he will certainly not be the last." "So be it," said the king. "Your land shall be free of all taxes, and Simon the seventh is pardoned." when the king gave each brother a goblet of wine and invited them to the wedding feast. Ooh, and what a feast it was, let me tell you. Man, that king's really know how to throw a wedding feast, honestly. Okay, I think I will do one more story. This one looks a little bit longer. Oh, yeah. Last story for the night. What the Rose Did to the Cypress, from the Brown Fairy book. Get a drink real quick. Okay, that one is empty. Let me open another. Reading is hydrating work. And this is a particularly long story. Okay. So, What the Rose Did to the Cypress, from the Brown Fairy book. Once upon a time, there was a great king in the east named Saman Ipolash, and he had 3 brave and clever sons, Tamaps, Kumas, and Almas Rubash. One day, when the king was sitting in his hall of audience, his eldest son, Prince Tahamaps, came before him, and after greeting his father with due respect, he said, "Oh, great father, I am tired of this town. If you will give me leave, I will take my servants tomorrow, and will go to the country and hunt in the hill skirts. And when I have taken some game, I will come back at evening prayer time." The father consented, and sent him with some of his own trusted servants, and also hawks and falcons, hunting dogs, cheetahs, and leopards. Okay. At the place where the prince intended to hunt, he saw the most beautiful deer. He ordered that it should not be killed, but trapped or captured with a noose. The deer looked about for a place where it might escape from the ring of the beaters, and spied one unwatched close to the prince himself. It bounded high and leapt right over his head, and got out of the ring, and tore like an eastern wind into the wastes. The prince put spurs to his horse and pursued it, and was soon lost in the sight of his followers, until the world-lightning sun stood above his head for the zenith. He did not take his eyes off the deer. Suddenly it disappeared behind some rising ground, and with all his search he could not find any further trace of it. He was now drenched in sweat, and he breathed with pain, and his horse's tongue wrung from its mouth with thirst. He dismounted and toiled on, with bridle and arm, praying and casting himself on the mercy of heaven. Then his horse fell, and surrendered his life to God. On and on he went across the sandy waste, weeping in his burning breast, till at length a hill rose to sight. He mustered his strength and climbed to the top. There he found a giant tree, whose foot was held firm on wrinkled earth, and whose crest touched the very heaven. Its branches put forth a glory of leaves, and there was grass and a spring underneath it, and flowers of many colors. Gladdened by this, he dragged himself to the water's edge, and drank his fill, and returned thanks for his deliverance from thirst. He looked about him, and, to his amazement, saw a close royal seat. While he was pondering what could have brought him to the merciless deserts, a man drew near who was dressed like a falcon, and had bare head and feet, but walked with the free carriage of a person of rank. His face was kind and wise and thoughtful, and he came on and spoke to the prince. "Oh, good youth, how did you come here? Who are you, and why do you come from?" The prince told everything just as it had happened to him, and then respectfully added, "I have made known my circumstances to you, and now I venture to beg you of your own. Who are you? How did you come to make your dwelling in this wilderness?" To this the Valkyrie replied, "O youth, it would be best for you to have nothing to do with me, and know nothing of my fortunes. My story is fit neither for telling nor hearing." The prince, however, pleaded so hard to be told that at last there was nothing to be done but to let him hear. "Listen and learn and know, young man. I am King Janjagir of Babylon, and that once I had an army and servants, family and treasures, untold wealth and belongings. Yeah, I'm thirsty just reading this. The Most High God gave me 7 sons who grew up well versed in the princely arts. My eldest son heard from travelers in Turkestan of the Chinese frontier. There a king named Chemus, the son of Timus, had an only child, a daughter named Mir Fruz, who, under all azure heaven, is unrivaled in beauty. Princes from all quarters to ask her hand, and on one and all she imposes a condition. She says to them, "I know a riddle, and I will marry anyone who answers it, and will bestow on him all my possessions. But if a suitor do not answer my question, I cut off his head and hang it in the battlements of the citadel." Now, the riddle she asks is, what did the rose do to the cypress? Now, when my son heard this tale, he fell in love with this unseen girl, and he came to me lamenting and bewailing himself. Nothing that I could say had the slightest effect on him. I said, "Oh, my son, there must be a fruit of this fancy of yours. I will lead forth a great army against Christmas, if he will give you his daughter freely. Well and good, and if not, I will ravage his kingdom and bring her away by force." This plan did not please him. "It is not right to lay a kingdom waste and destroy a palace that is I may attain to desire. I will go alone, I will answer the riddle, and win her in this way." At last, out of pity for him, I let him go. He reached the city of King Quimus. He was asked the riddle and could not give the true answer, and his head was cut off and hung from the battlements. Then I mourned him in black raiment for 40 days. After this, another and another of my sons were seized by the same desire, and in the end, all my 7 sons went, and all were killed. And wearing myself away in sorrow. Prince Talmat listened to this tale, and then an arrow of love for this unseen girl struck his heart also. Just at this moment of his ill fate, his people came up and gathered him round like moths to a light. They brought him a horse, fleet as the breeze of the dawn, and set his willing foot in the stirrup easily and rode off. As days went by, the thorn of love rankled in his heart, and he became the very example of lovers, and grew from the face of his love, and then set the matter before his father, King Saman Elposh. "Your son, Prince Talmap, loves distractedly the Princess Mirafuts, the daughter of King Quimus, and son of Timus." Then they told the king about her and her doings. A mist of sadness clouded the king's mind, and he said to his son, "If this thing is so, I will in first place send a courier with friendly letters to King Quimus, and will ask the hand of the daughter for you. I will send an abundance of gifts, and a string of camels laden with flashing stones and rubies of Badakostan. In this way I will bring her to your suite, and I will give her to you to be your solace. But if King Quimus is unwilling to give her to you, I will pour a whirlwind of soldiers upon him, and I will bring to you in this way the most consequential of girls." But the prince said that this plan would not be right, and that he would go himself. He would answer the riddle. Then the king's wise men said, "This is a very weighty matter. It would be best to allow the prince to set out accompanied by some persons in whom you have confidence. Maybe he will repent and come back." So King Salmon ordered all preparations for a journey to be made. Then Prince Tamap set his leave and set out, accompanied by some of the courtiers and taking with him a string of 2 humped camels and laden with jewels and gold and costly stuffs. By stage after stage, and after many days' journeying, he arrived at the city of King Quimus. What did he see? A towering citadel whose foot kept firm in wrinkled earth, and whose battlements touched the blue heaven. He saw hanging from its battlements many heads of men. But it was not the least effect upon him that these heads were men of rank. He listened to no advice about laying aside his fancy, but rode up to the gate and on into the heart of the city. The place was so splendid that the eyes of the ages had never seen its like, and there, in an open square, he found a tent of crimson satin set up, and beneath it 2 jeweled drums with jeweled sticks. These drums were put there so that the suitors of the princess might announce their arrival by beating on them, after which someone would come and take them to the king's presence. The sight of the drums stirred a fire in Prince Tamup's love. He dismounted and moved towards him, but his companions hurried after and begged him first to let them go and announce him to the king, and said that then, when they were in their possession in a place of security, they would enter on the important matter of the princess. The prince, however, replied that there was only one thing, that his first duty was to beat the drum and announce himself as a suitor, when he would be taken, as such, to the king, who would then give him proper lodgment. So he struck upon the drums, and at once summoned an officer who took him to King Quimus. When the king saw how very young the prince looked, and that he was still drinking from the fountain of wonder, he said, "Oh, youth, leave aside this fancy which my daughter has conceived in the pride of her beauty. No one can answer her riddle, and she has done to death many men who have had the pleasure and have not tasted its charm. God forbid that your young spring should also be ravaged by the autumn winds of martyrdom." All his urgency, however, had no effect on making the prince withdraw. At length it was settled between them that 3 days should be given to the pleasant hospitality, and that he should follow what should be said and done. Then the prince went to his own quarters and was treated as become his station. That's a fun message I pop up. King Quimus now sent for his daughter and for her mother, Golruk, and talked to them. He said to Merifoots, "Listen to me, you cruel flirt. Why do you persist on this folly? Another has come to ask your hand a prince of the East, so handsome that our very own son grows modest in the splendor of his face. He is rich and has brought gold and jewels, all for you, and if you will marry him, a better husband you will not find. But the arguments of father and mother were wasted, for her only answer was, "Oh, my father, I have sworn to myself that I will not marry even if 1,000 years go by, unless someone answers my riddle, and that I will give myself to the man only who deserves it." 3 days passed. Then the riddle was asked. What did the rose do to the cypress? The prince had an eloquent tongue and could split a hair without hesitation. He replied to her with a verse. Only the omnipotent has knowledge of secrets if any man says, I know. Do not believe him. Then a servant fetched in a polluted, blue-eyed headsmith who asked, polluted, whose sun of life has come near to setting, and took the prince by the arm, placed him on the cloth of execution, and then, all merciless and stony-hearted, cut his head from his body and hung it on the battlements. The news of the death of Prince Talmaps plunged his father into despair and stupefaction. He mourned for him in black raiment for 40 days, and then, a few days later, his second son, Prince Quamus, extracted from him the leave to go too. And he also was put to death. Only one son now remained. The brave, eloquent, happy-natured Prince Almas Bakish. One day when his father sat brooding over his lost children, Almas came before him and said, "O father of mine, the daughter of King Quamus has done my 2 brothers to death. I wish to avenge them upon her." These words brought his father to tears. "O light of your father," he cried, "I have one left but you, and now you wish to ask me to go to your death." "Dear father," pleaded the prince, "until I have lowered the pride of that beauty, and have set her here before you, I cannot settle down, or indeed sit down on my feet." In the end, he too got leave to go, but he went without a following, and alone. Like his brothers, he made the long journey to the city of Quimus, the son of Timus, and like them he saw the citadel, but he saw the heads of Thomas and Quamus. He went about in the city, he saw the tent and the drums, and then went out again into the village not far off, where he found a very old man who had a wife 120 years old, or rather more. Their lives were coming to their end, but they had never beheld the face of their own child. They were glad when the prince came to their house, and they dwelt with him as with the son. He put all his belongings into their charge and fastened his horse to their outhouse. Then he asked them not to speak of him to anyone, and to keep his affairs secret. He exchanged his royal dress for another, and the next morning, just as the sun looked forth from the eastern oratory, he went again into the city. He turned over in his mind without ceasing how he was to find out the meaning of the riddle, and to give them the right answer. And who could help him, and how to avenge his brothers? He wandered about the city, but heard nothing of service, for there was no one in all the land who understood the riddle of the Princess Mirafrus. One day he thought that he would go to her own palace and see if he learned anything there. So he went out to her garden house. It was a very splendid place, with a wonderful gateway, and walls like Alexander's ramparts. Many gatekeepers were on guard, and there was no chance of passing them. His heart was full of bitterness, but he said to himself, "Oh, woe is me! It is here that I shall get what I want." He went around the garden wall, hoping to find a gap, and he made a supplication in the court of supplications and prayed, "O holder of the hand of the helpless, show me my way." While he prayed, he bethought himself that he could get into the garden with a stream of inflowing water. He looked carefully around, fearing he might be seen, stripped, and slid into the stream, and was carried with the great walls. There he hid himself till his loincloth was dry. The garden was very Eden, with water running along its lawns, with flowers and the lament of doves and a jug of nightingales. It was a place to steal the senses from the brain, and he wandered about and saw the house, and there seemed to be no one there. In the forecourt was a royal seat of polished jasper, and in the middle of the platform of the basin of purest water that flashed like a mirror. He pleased himself with these sights for a while, and then he went back to the garden and hid himself from the gardeners and passed the night. Next morning he put on the appearance of a madman and wandered about till he came to the lawn where several pert-faced girls were amusing themselves. On the throne, jeweled and overspread with silken stuffs, sat a girl of a splendor whose beauty lighted up the place, and whose ambergris and attar perfumed the whole air. "That must be a mirror of fruits," he thought. "She is lovely indeed." Just then one of the attendants came to the water's edge to fill a cup, and though the prince was in hiding, his face was reflected in the water. When she saw this image, she was frightened and let her cup fall into the stream. Thought, "Is it an angel, a peri, or a man?" Fear and trembling took hold of her, and she screamed as women scream. Then some of the other girls came to take her to the princess, who asked, "What is the matter, pretty one?" "Oh, princess, I went for water, and I saw an image, and I was afraid." So another girl went to the water, and saw the same thing, and came back with the same story. The princess wished to see for herself. She rose and paced to the spot with the march and the prancing peacock. When she saw the image, she said to her nurse, "Find out who is reflected in the water and where he lives." Her words reached the prince's ear. He lifted up his head, and she saw him and beheld beauty such as she had never seen before. She lost 100 hearts to him and sighed to her nurse to bring him to her presence. The prince let himself be persuaded to go with the nurse, but when the princess questioned him as to who he was and how he got into her garden, he behaved like a man out of his mind. Sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes saying, "I'm hungry," or words misplaced or random. Civil mixed with rude. "What a pity," said the princess. "He is mad." And she liked him. She said, "He is my madman. Let no one hurt him." She took him to her house and told him not to go away, for that she would provide for all his wants. The prince thought, "It would be excellent in here, in her very house. I could get the answer to her riddle, but I must be silent, on pain of death." Now, the princess's household, there was a girl called Del Aram. She it was who had first seen the image of the prince. She came to love him very much, and spent day and night thinking how she could make her affection much, no, make her affection known to him. Yeah. One day she escaped to the princess's notice and went to the prince and laid her head on his feet and said, "Heaven has bestowed on you, beauty and charm. Tell me your secret. Who are you? How did you come here? I love you very much, and if you would like me to leave this place, I will go with you. I have wealth equal to the treasure of the mines of the Aquarian. But the prince on but the prince only made answer like a man distraught, and told her nothing. He said to himself, God forbid that veil should be taken in vain for my secret. That would indeed disgrace me. So, with streaming eyes and burning breast, Dilaram arose and went to her house, and lamented and fretted. Now, whenever the princess commanded the prince's attendance, Dilaram, of all the girls, paid him attention, and waited on him best. The princess noticed this, and said, Oh, Dilaram, you must take my madman into your charge and give him whatever he wants. This was the very thing Dilaram had prayed for. A little later she took the prince into a private place, and she made him take an oath of secrecy. And she herself took one and swore, By heaven, I will not tell your secret. Tell me about yourself so that I may help you get what you want. The prince now recognized in her words of perfume of true love, and he made compact with her. Oh, lovely girl, I want to know what the rose did to the cypress. Your mistress cuts off men's heads because of this riddle. What is at the bottom of it, and why does she do it? Then Dilaram answered, If you will promise to marry me and keep me always among those who you favor, I will tell you. I know, and I will keep watch about this riddle. Oh, lovely girl, rejoined he, if I accomplish my purpose so that I need no longer strive for it, I will keep my company with you. When I have this woman in my power and have avenged my brothers, I will make you my solace. Oh, wealth of my life and source of my joy, responded Dilaram. I do not know what the rose did to the cypress, but so much I know that the person who told my reference about it was a Negro who she hides under the house. He fled from Quercus. It is there you must make inquiry. There is no other way of getting at the truth. On hearing these words, the prince said to his heart, Oh, my heart, your task will yet wear away much of your life. He fell into long and far thought. Dilaram looked at him and said, Oh, my life and my soul, do not be sad. If you would like this woman killed, I will put poison into her cup so that she will never lift her head from her drugged sleep again. Wow. 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 Oh, Dilaram, such vengeance is not manly. I shall not rest till I have gone to Wak of the Caucasus and have cleared up the matter. Then they repeated their agreement about their marriage, and bade one another good-bye. The prince now went back to the village, and told the old man that he was set out on another long journey, and begged him not to be anxious, and to keep safe the goods which he had brought and entrusted to him. The prince had not the least knowledge of the way to Wak of the Caucasus, and was cast down in the sense of helplessness. He was walking along by his horse's side, when there appeared before him an old man of serene countenance, dressed in green and carrying a staff, who resembled a Kazir. The prince thanked heaven, laid his hands in reverence on his breast, and salaamed. The old man returned this greeting graciously, and asked, How fare you? Whither are you bound? You look like a traveller. Oh, reverend saint, I am in this difficulty. I do not know the way to Wak of the Caucasus. The old man of good counsel looked at the young prince and said, Turn back from this dangerous undertaking. Do not go. Choose some other task. If you had 100 lives, you would not bring out safe this journey. But his words had no effect on the prince's resolve. Of course. What object have you, the old man asked, in this consuming your life? I have an important piece of business to do, and only this journey makes it possible. I must go, I pray you. In God's name, tell me the way. Then the saint saw that the prince was not to be moved. He said, Learn and know, O youth, that the work of oath is in the carcass and the dependency of it. In it there are jinns, demons, and berries. You must go along this road till it forks into three. Take neither the right hand nor the left, but the middle path. Follow it for a day and a night. Then you will come to a column on which the marble slab inscribed with Kufic characters. Do what is written there. Beware of disobedience. Then he gave his good wishes for the journey and his blessing. And the prince kissed his feet and said goodbye, and, with thanks to the causer of causes, took the road. After a day and a night, he saw the column rise in silent beauty to the heavens. Everything was as the wise old man had said it would be, and the prince, who was skilled in all tongues, read the following Kufkic inscription. O travelers, let it be known to you that this column has been set up with its tablets to give true directions about these roads. If a man passes life in ease and pleasantness, let him take the right path. If he take the left, he will have some trouble, but will reach his goal without much delay. Woe to him who chooses the middle path. If he had 1,000 lives, he would not save one. It is very hazardous. It leads to Cuscus, and is an endless road. Beware of it. The prince read this and bowed his head, and lifted his hands in supplication to him who has no needs, and prayed, O friend of the traveller, I, thy servant, come to thee for succour. My purpose lies in the land of oath. My road is full of peril. Lead me by it. Then he took a handful of earth and cast it about his collar, and said, O earth, be thou my grave and thy vest. Be thou my winding sheet. Then he took the middle road, and went along it. Day after day, with many a silent prayer, till he saw trees rise in their weary waste of sand. They grew in a garden, and he went up to the gate, and found it a slab of beautifully worked marble, and that near it lay sleeping with its head on stone, a negro whose face was so black that it made the darkness around him. His upper lip, arched like a bow, curved upward to his nostrils, and his lower hung down like a camel's. 4 millstones formed his shield, and on a box tree close by hung his giant sword. His loincloth was fashioned of 12 skins of beasts, and was bound round his waist by a chain which each link was as big as an elephant's thigh. Big dude. The prince approached and tied up his horse near the negro's head. Then he let fall the Bismillah from his lips, entered the garden, and walked through till he came to the private part, delighting in great trees, and lovely verdure, and the flowery borders. In the inner garden there were very many deer. These signed to him with eye and foot to go back, for that this was enchanted ground. But he did not understand them, and thought their pretty gestures were welcome. After a while he reached the palace, which had a porch more splendid than Caesar's, and was built of gold and silver bricks. In its doors, each having opposite in its In its midst was a high seat, overlaid with fine carpets, and into it opened 8 doors, each having opposite to it a marble basin. Banishing care, Prince Almus walked through the gates of the garden, when suddenly a window opened and a girl, who was lovely enough to make the moon writhe in jealousy, put out her head. She lost her heart to the good looks of the prince, and sent her nurse to fetch him, so that she might learn where he came from and how he got into her private garden where even lions and wolves did not venture. The nurse went and was struck with amazement at the sunlike radiance of his face, and salaamed and said, "O youth, welcome to the garden of my lady. She calls you. Come." He went with her to the palace, which was like a house in paradise. He saw seated on the royal carpets of throne a girl whose brilliance shamed the shining sun. He salaamed, she rose and took him by the hand and led him near her. "Oh, young man, who are you? Where do you come from, and how did you get into this garden?" He told her his story from beginning to end, and Lady Latifa replied, "This is folly. It will make you a vagabond of the earth and lead you to destruction. Come, cease such talk. No one can go to the carcass. Stay with me and be thankful, for here is a throne which you can share with me, and in my society you can enjoy the wealth. I will do whatever you wish. I'll bring you here King Crumis and his daughter, and you can deal with them as you will." "Oh, Lady Latifa," he said, "I have made a compact with heaven not to sit down off my feet till I have been to Whack of Quaff, and have cleared this matter, and have taken Mephirophus from her father, as brave men take, and put her in a prison. When I have done all this, I will come back to you in state and with the following. I will marry you according to the law." That's what he promised. Lady Latifa argued and urged her wishes, but in vain. The prince was not to be moved. Then she called for the cupbearers for new wine, for she thought that when his head was hot it might consent to stay. The pure, clear wine was brought. She filled a cup and gave it to him. He said, "Oh, most enchanting sweetheart, it is a rule for the host to drink first, and then the guest." So, to make him lose his head, she drained the cup, then filled it again and gave it to him. He drank it off, and she took a lute from one of the singers and played upon it with skill which witched away the senses of all who heard it. But it was all in vain. 3 days passed with such festivities, and on the 4th the prince said, "O joy of my eyes, I beg you that now that you will let me bid you farewell, for my way is losing, and the fire of your love darts flame into the harvest of my heart. By heaven's grace I may accomplish my purpose, and if so, I will come back to you." Now she saw that she could not in any way change his resolve. She told her nurse to bring a certain casket, which contained, she said, something exhilarating, which would help the prince on his journey. The box was brought, and she divided off a portion of what was within and gave it to the prince to eat. Then, and while he was all unaware, she put a fourth of her hand to a stick fashioned under a snake. She said some words over it and struck him so sharply at the shoulder that he cried out. Then he made a pirouette and found that he was a deer. When he knew what had been done to him, he thought, "All my threads of affection are gathered together. I have lost my chance." He tried to escape, but the magician sent for her goldsmith, who, coming, overlaid the deer horns with gold and jewels. The kerchief which that day she had had in her hand was untied around his neck, and this freed it from her attentions. The prince deer was now bounded to the garden, and once brought some way of escape. it found none. It joined the other deer, which soon made it their leader. Now, although the prince had been transformed into the form of a deer, he kept his man's heart and mind. He said to himself, "Thank heaven that Lady Latifah changed me into this shape, for at least the deer are beautiful." He remained for some time living as a deer among the rest, and at length resolved that an end to such a life must be put ill some way. He looked again for some place by which he could get out of the magic gardens. Following the wall around, he reached the lower part. He remembered the divine names and flung himself over, saying, "Whatever happens is by the wall of God." When he looked about, he found that he was in the very same place he had jumped from. There was the palace, there the garden, and the deer. 8 times he leaped over the wall, and 8 times he found himself where he had started from. But the 9th time there was a change. There was a palace, there was a garden, but the deer were gone. Presently a girl of such moon-like beauty opened a window that the prince lost her in 100 hearts. She was delighted with a beautiful deer, and cried to her nurse, "Catch it if you will, I will give you this necklace, every pearl of which is worth a kingdom." The nurse coveted the pearls. She was 300 years old, and she did not know how she could catch a deer. However, she went down to the garden and held out some grass, but when she went near the creature, it ran away. The girl watched with great excitement from the palace window, and called, "Oh, nurse, if you don't catch it, I will kill you." "I'm killing myself," cried the old woman. The girl saw that the nurse tottering along and went down to help, matching with the gait of the prancing peacock. When she saw the gilded horns in the kerchief, she said, "It must be accustomed to the hand, and must be a royal pet." The prince had it in his mind that this might be another magician who could give him some other sort of shape, but still it seemed best to allow himself to be caught. So he played about the girl and let her catch him by the neck. A leash was brought, fruits were given, and it was caressed with delight. It was taken to the palace and tied by the foot to Lady Jamila's raised seat. But she ordered a longer cord to be brought so that it might be able to jump up beside her. When the nurse went to fix the cord, she saw tears falling from its eyes, and that it was dejected and sorrowful. "Oh, Lady Jamila, this wonderful deer is crying. I've never seen a deer cry before." Jamila darted down like a flash of lightning, and saw that it was so. She rubbed its head on her feet, and then shook it so sadly that the girl cried for sympathy. She patted it and said, "Why are you sad, my heart? Why do you cry, my soul? Is it because I have caught you? I love you better than my own life." But, despite her comforting, it cried more. Then Jamila said, "Unless I am mistaken, this is the work of my wicked sister Latifah, who by magic art turns servants of God into beasts of the field." At these words the deer uttered sounds, and laid its head on her feet. Then Jamila was sure it was a man, and said, "Be comforted, I shall restore you to your own shape." She bathed herself and ordered the deer to be bathed, and then put on a clean raiment, called for a box which stood in the alcove, opened it, and gave a portion of what was in it to the deer to eat. Then she slipped her hand under her carpet and produced a stick, to which she said something. She struck the deer hard, it pirouetted, and became Prince Almas. The embroidered kerchief and the jewels lay upon the ground. The prince prostrated himself in thanks to heaven and to Jamila, and said, "Oh, delicious person! Oh, Chinese Venus! How I shall excuse myself for giving you so much trouble! With what words can I thank you?" Then she called for a clothes wallet and chose a royal dress of honor. Her attendants dressed him in it, and brought him again before the tender-hearted lady. She turned to him 100 hearts, and took his hand, and seated him beside her. "O youth, tell me truly who you are, and where you come from, and how you fell into the power of my sister." Even when he was a deer, the prince was much admired Jamila. Now he thought her 1,000 times more lovely than before. He judged that in truth alone was safety, and he told her his whole story. Then she asked, "Oh, Prince Amos Roshbakash, do you still wish so much to make this journey to Whack of Quaff? What hope is there in it? The road is dangerous even near here. This is not yet the border to the Caucasus. Come, give it up. It is a great risk, and to go is not wise. It would be a pity for a man like you to fall into the hands of the jinns and demons. Stay with me, and I will welcome you as you wish." "Oh, most delicious person," he answered, "you are very generous, and the choice of my life in truth is in your hands. But I beg one favor of you. If you love me, so do I too love you. If you really love me, do not forbid me to make this journey, but help me as far as you can. Then it may be that I shall fall to succeed, and if I return with my purpose fulfilled, I will marry you according to the law, and take you to my own country, where we will spend the rest of our lives together in pleasure and good companionship. Help me if you can. Give me your counsel." "Oh, very stuff of my life," replied Jamila. "I give you things that are not of king's treasures, and which will be the greatest use to you. First, there are my bow and arrows of reverence uh, reverence to Prophet Saleth. Secondly is the scorpion of Solomon, on whom he feasts, which is a sword which no king has. Steel and stone are one of it. If you bring it down on a rock, it will not be injured, and if you cleave whatever you strike. Thirdly, there is the dagger which sage Timus made himself. This is most useful. The man who wears it will not bend under 7 camels' loads. What you have to do first is to get home in the Cypress, and to make friends with him. If he favors you, he will take you to Whack of Quaff. If not, you will never get there. For 7 seas are on the way, and they are such seas that if all kings of the earth and all their viziers and all the wise men considered for 1,000 years, they would not be able to cross it." "Oh, most delicious person, where is Sigmar's home? How shall I get there?" "Oh, new fruit of life, you must do just what I tell you, and you must use your eyes and your brains. For if you don't, you will find yourself at the place of the Negroes, who are bloodthirsty set, and God forbid they should lay their hands on my precious person." Then she took the bow and quiver of arrows, the sword, and the dagger out of a box, and let the prince let fall to Bismillah, and girth them all on. Then Jamila, of the hoary face, produced 2 saddlebags of ruby-red silk, one filled with roasted fowl and little cakes, and the other full of stones of price. Next she gave him a horse as swift as the breeze of the morning, and she said,
"Accept all these from me. You will ride till the rising ground, at no great distance from here, where there is a spring. It is called the Place of Gifts, and you must stay there one night. There you will see many wild beasts, lions, tigers, leopards, apes, and so on. Before you get there, you must capture some game. On the long road between there dwells a Lion King, and if other beasts did not fear him, they would ravage the whole country and let no one pass. The lion is a red transgressor, so when he comes to rise and do reverence, take a cloth and rub the dust and earth from his face. Then set the game you have taken before him, well cleansed, and lay hands in respect on your breast. When he finishes to eat, take your knife and cut pieces of the meat and set them before him with a bow. And this way you will unfold that Lion King into a perfect friendship. And he will be most useful to you. And you will be safe from molestation by the Negroes. When you go on from the place of gifts, be sure that you do not take the right road. Take the left, for the other leads to the Negro Castle, which is known as a place of clashing swords, and where there are 40 Negro captains over each 3,000 and 4,000 more. Their chief is Tarmac. Further on than this is the home of Sigmar.
Having stored these things in the prince's memory, she said,
You will see everything happen just as I have said.
Then she escorted him a little way. They parted, and she went home to mourn his absence. Prince Almus, relying on the causer of causes, rode on to the place of gifts and dismounted at the platform. Everything happened as Jamila had foretold. When 1 or 2 watches of the night had passed, he saw that the open ground before him was full of such stately and splendid animals as he had never seen before. By and by they made their way for a wonderfully big lion, which was 80 yards from nose to tail tip. It's a big kitty, and was a magnificent creature. The prince advanced and saluted him, and proudly drooped his head and forelocks and paced to the platform. 70 and 80 others were with it, and now encircled at a little distance. It laid its right paw over its left, and the prince took the handkerchief Jamila had given him for the purpose, and rubbed the dust and earth from its face. Then brought forward the game he had prepared, and crossing his hands respectfully on his breast, stood waiting before it. When it wished for food to be cut off in pieces of meat and put them into his mouth. The serving lions also came near the prince, who would have stayed his hand, but the Lion King signed to him to feed them too. This he did, laying the meat on the platform. Then the Lion King beckoned the prince to come near and said, "Sleep at ease. My guards will watch." So, surrounded by a lion guard, he slept till dawn, when the king lion said goodbye, and gave him a few of his own hairs, and said, "When you're in difficulty, burn one of these, and I will be there." And then it went off to the jungle. Prince Almus immediately started. He rode till he came to the parting of ways. He remembered quite well that the right hand was the short and dangerous. He bethought himself, too, that whatever was written on his forehead would happen, and took the forbidden road. And by he saw a castle, and knew from what Jamila had told him that this was a place of clashing swords. He would have liked to go back the way he had come, but courage forbade it, and he said, "What has been preordained from eternity will happen to me," and went on towards the castle. He was thinking of tying his horse to a tree which grew near the gates when the Negro came out and spied him. "Ah," said the wretch himself, "this is good. Tom Tack has not eaten man meat for a long time, and his craving is for some. I will take this creature to him." And he took hold of the prince's reins, and said, "Dismount, man-child. Come to my master. He is wanted to eat man meat this time long back." "What nonsense are you saying?" said the prince, and other such words. When the negro understood that he was being abused, he cried, "Come along. I will put you into such a state that the birds of the air will weep for you." Then the prince drew the scorpion of Solomon and struck him on the leathern belt, and shore him through so that the sword came out to the other side. He stood upright for a little while, muttered some words, put his hand on the prince to see, put out his hand to seize the prince. then fell in 2 pieces and surrendered his life. There was water close at hand, and the prince made his absolution, and then said, "O my heart, wonderful task lies upon you." The second Negro came out of the fort, and seeing what had been done, went back and told his chief. Others wished to be doubled, and went out, and every one, the scorpion of Solomon, made 2. Then Taram sent for a giant Negro named Chulmak, who in the day of battle was worth 300, and said to him, "I shall thank you much to fetch me that man." Hey, Sammy. Chilmack went out, tall as a tower and bearing a shield of 8,000,000 stones, and as he walked he shouted, "Oh, blunderhead! By what right do you come to our country and kill our people? Come, make me too." As the prince was despicable in his eyes, he tossed aside his club and rushed to grip the man with his hands. He caught him by the collar and tucked him under his arm and set off with him to Taramtak. But the prince drew the dagger of Timus and thrust it upwards to the giant's armpit for its full length. This made Chilmuk drop him and try to pick up his club, but when it stooped, the mighty sword shore him through the wrist. When news of his champion's death reached Taramtak, he put himself at the head of an army of his Negroes and led them forth. It's definitely going. Many fell before the magic sword, and the prince labored on in spite of his weakness and fatigue, till he was almost worn out. In a moment of respite from attack, he struck his fire steel and burned the hair of the Lion King. And as he just succeeded in this when the Negroes charged again, but all took him prisoner. Suddenly, behind the distant veil of the deserts, appeared an army of lions led by their king. "What brings these scourges of heaven here?" cried the Negroes. They came roaring up and put fresh life into the prince. He fought on, and when struck the belt of the wearer fell in 2, and when on the head of a cleft to the waist. Then the 10,000 mighty lions joined the fray and tore to pieces man and horse. Taramtak was left alone. He would have retired into his fort, but the prince shouted, "Whither away, accursed one? Are you fleeing before me?" At these defiant words, the chief shouted back, "Welcome, man. Come here, and I will soften you to the wax beneath my club." Then he hurled his club at the prince's head, but it fell harmless because the prince had quickly spurred his horse forward. The chief, believing that he had hit him, was looking down for him when all at once he came up behind and cleft him to the waist and sent him straight to hell. Good story, huh? The king lion greatly praised the dashing courage of Prince Almus. They went together to the castle of Clashing Swords and found it adorned and fitting a princely fashion. In it was the daughter of Taramtak, still a child. She sent a message to Prince Almus, saying, "O king of the world, choose a slave to be your handmaid. Keep her with you where you go. There she will go." He sent for her, and she kissed his feet and received the Mussulman faith at his hands. He told her he was going on a long journey on important business, and that when he came back, he would take her and her possessions to his own country. but that for the present she must stay in the castle. Then he made over the fort and all that was in it to the care of the lion, saying, "Guard them, brother, let no one lay hand on them." He said goodbye, chose a fresh horse from the chief's stable, and once again took to the road. After traveling many stages and for many days, he reached a plain of marvelous beauty and refreshment. It was carpeted with flowers, roses, tulips, and clover. It had lovely lawns, and among them running water. This choicest place of earth filled him with wonder. There was a tree such as he had never seen before. Its branches were alike, but it bore flowers and fruit of 1,000 kinds. Near it a reservoir had been fashioned of 4 sorts of stone: touchstone, pure stone, marble, and lodestone. In and out of it flowed water like an adder. The prince felt sure that this must be the place of summer. He dismounted and turned his horse loose to graze, ate some of the food Jamoa had given him, and drank from the stream, and lay down to sleep. He was still dozing when he roused by the neighing and pawing of his horse. When he could see clearly, he made out the mountain-like dragon whose breast crushed the stones beneath it to putty. He remembered the 1,000 names of God, and took a bow south from its case and the 3 arrows from the quiver. He bound the dagger of Timus firmly to his waist, and hung the scorpion of Solomon around his neck. Then he set an arrow on the string, and released it with such force that it went into the monster's eye, right up to the notch. The dragon writhed on itself, and belched forth evil vapor, and beat the ground with its head until the earth shook. Then the prince took a second arrow, and shot it in the throat. It drew in its breath, and it would have sucked the prince into its maw. But when it was within striking distance, he drew the sword, and, having committed himself to God, struck a mighty blow which cut the creature's neck down to the gullet. The foul vapor of the beast and the horror of its strangeness now overcame the prince, and he fainted. When he came to himself, he found that he was drenched in the gore of the monster's head. He rose and thanked God for his deliverance. The nest of the simmer was a wonderful tree above him, and in it were young birds. The parents were away searching for food. They always told the children, before they left them, not to put their heads out of the nest. But today, at the noise of the fight below, they looked down and saw the whole affair. By the time the dragon was killed, they were very hungry, and set up a clamor for food. The prince therefore cut up the dragon, and fed them with it, bit by bit, till they ate the whole thing. Then he washed himself and lay down to rest, and he was still asleep when the summer came home. As a rule, young birds raised a clamor to welcome their parents came home. But on this day they were so full of dragon meat that they had no choice. They had to go to sleep. As they flew near, the old birds saw the prince lying under the tree, and saw no sign of life in the nest. They thought that the misfortune which for so many earlier years had befallen them had happened again, and that their nestlings had disappeared. They had never been able to find out their murderer, and now suspected the prince. "He has eaten our children and slept after it. He must die," said the father bird, and flew back to the hills and clawed up a huge stone which he meant to let fall on the prince's head. But his mate said, "Let us look into the nest first, for kill an innocent person who condemn us on the day of resurrection." They flew nearer, and presently the young birds woke and cried, "Mother, what have you brought for us?" As young birds say. And they told the whole story of the fight, and how they were alive only by the favor of the young man under the tree, and of his cutting up the dragon and offering and feeding it to him. The mother bird remarked, "Truly, father, you are about to go do a strange thing, and a terrible sin has been averted from you." and Simmer flew off in the distance with a great stone and dropped it. It sank down in the very middle of the earth. Coming back, the Simmer saw that the little sunshine fell upon the prince through the leaves, and it spread its wings and shaded him till he woke. When he got up, he salaamed to it, who returned the greeting with joy and gratitude, and caressing him, said, "O youth, tell me true, who are you, and where are you doing? And how did you cross the pitiless deserts where never yet foot of man has trod?" The prince told his story from the beginning and end, and finished, saying, "Now it is my heart's wish that you should help me get the whack of Cascas. Perhaps by your favor I will accomplish my task and avenge my brothers." In reply, the Simmer first blessed the deliverer of his children, and then went on, "What you have done no child of man has ever done before. So surely you have claim to all my help, for every year up until now the dragon has come here and destroyed my nestlings. And by God's grace you have removed my children's powerful foe. I regard you as a child of my own. Stay with me. I will give you everything you desire, and I will establish a city here for you, and will furnish it with every possible requisite. I will give you the land of Caucasus, and will make its princes subject to you. Give up the journey to Whack. It is full of risk, and the jinns there will certainly kill you." But nothing could move the prince, and seeing this, the bird went on. "Well, so be it. When you wish to set forth, you must go into the plain and take 7 head of deer, and must make watertight bags of their hides, and keep their flesh in 7 portions. 7 seas lie on your way. I will carry you over them. But if I have not food or drink, we shall fall into the sea and be drowned. When I ask you to put the food and water into my mouth, we shall make the journey safely." The prince did all as he was told, and they took flight. They crossed the 7 seas, and at each one the prince fed the Simmer. When they alighted on the shore of the last sea, it said, "Oh, my son, there lies your road. Forward to the city. Take 3 feathers of mine, and if you have any difficulty, burn one, and I will be with you in the twinkling of an eye." The prince walked on in solitude till it reached the city. He went in, and wandered through all quarters, through the bazaars, lanes, and squares, and the least knowing for whom he could ask the information to be part of the riddle of Mirafuz. He spent 7 days thinking over it in silence. From the first day of his coming, he had made friends with a young cloth merchant, and a great liking had sprung up between them. One day he said abruptly to his companion, "Oh, dear friend, I wish you would tell me what the rose did to Cypress, and what the sense of the riddle is." The merchant started, and exclaimed, "If there were not brotherly affection between us, I would cut off your head for asking me this." "If you meant to kill me," retorted the prince, "you would still have told me the first word I know." When the merchant saw the prince was in deadly earnest, he said, "If you wish to hear the truth of the matter, you must wait upon our king. There is no other way. No one else will tell you. I have a well-wisher at the court named Farrokh Fall. He will introduce you to him." "That would be excellent," cried the prince. A meeting was arranged between Farrokh Fall and Almas, and then the emir took him to the king's presence and introduced him as a stranger and a traveler who has come from afar to sit in the shadow of King Sinubar. Simmer had given the prince a diamond weighing 30 mescals, and they offered it to the king, who at once recognized its value and asked where it had been obtained. "I, your slave, once had riches and power. There have been many stones in my country. On the way here I was plundered by a castle of clashing swords. I saved this one thing only, hidden in my bathing cloth." In return for the diamond, King Cinnabar showered gifts of greater value, for he remembered that it was the last possession of the prince. He showed the utmost kindness and hospitality, and gave his vizier orders to install the prince in the royal guest house. He took much pleasure in his visitor's society. They were together every day and spent most of the time pleasantly. Several times the king said, "Ask me for something, and I may give it to you." One day he so pressed to know what would pleasure the prince that the latter said, "I have only one wish, and that I know the name to you in private." The king at once commanded everyone to withdraw, and then Prince Amen said, "The desire of my life is to know what the rose did to the cypress, and what the meaning is in these words." The king was astounded. "In God's name, if anyone else had said that to me, I would have his head cut off instantly." The prince heard this in silence, and presently so beguiled the king with pleasant talk that the king himself was responsible. Time flew by. The king again and again begged the prince to ask some gift of him, and always received the same reply: "I wish for your majesty's welfare. What more do I desire?" One night there was a banquet, and the cupbearers carried round gold and silver cups with sparkling wine, and singers with their sweetest voices contended for the prize. The prince drank from the king's own cup, and when his head was hot with the wine, he took a lute from one of the musicians and placed himself on the carpet border and sang till he whisked away the sense of anyone who listened. Applause and compliments rang from every side. The king filled his cup and called the prince and gave it to him. "Name your wish, it's yours." The prince drained off the wine and answered, "O king of the world, learn and know what I have only one aim in life, and that is to know what the rose did to the cypress." "Never yet," replied the king, "has any man come from the question alive. If this is your only wish, so be it, I will tell you. But I will do so on only one condition, namely, when you have heard, you will submit yourself to death." To this the prince agreed, and said, "I set my foot firmly on this contract." The king then gave an order to the attendant. A costly carpet overlaid with European velvet was placed before him, and a dog was led in by a golden and jeweled chain, and set upon the splendid stuffs. A band of fair girls came in and stood around it in waiting. Then, with ill words, 12 negroes dragged in a lovely woman, fettered on hands and feet, and meanly dressed, and they set her down on the bare floor. She was extraordinarily beautiful, and shamed the glorious sun. The king ordered 100 stripes be laid on her tender body. She sighed a long sigh. Food was called for, and tablecloths were spread. Delicate meats were set before the dog, and water was given in a royal cup of Chinese crystal. When it had eaten its fill, its leavings were placed before the lovely woman, and she was made to eat them. She wept, and her tears were pearls. She smiled, and her lips shed roses. Pearls and flowers were gathered up and taken to the treasury. "Now," said the king, "you have seen these things and their purpose fulfilled." "Truly," said the prince, "I have seen things which I have not understood, and what they mean. And what is the story to them? Tell me and kill me." Then the king said, "The woman you see here in chains is my wife. She is called Gull, the Rose. I am Cinnabar, the Cypress. One day I was hunting and became very thirsty. After great search, I discovered a well in a place so secret that neither bird nor beast nor man could find it without labor. I was alone. I took off my turban for a rope and my cap for a bucket. There was a good deal of water, and when I let down my rope, something caught it, and I could not in any way draw it back. I shouted into the well, 'O servant of God, whoever you are, why do you deal unfairly with me? I am dying of thirst. Let go in God's name.' A cry came up in answer.
"O servant of God, we have been in the well for such a long time. In God's name, get us out."
After trying 1,000 times, I drew up 2 blind women. They said they were Peris, and that their king had blinded them in his anger and left them in the well alone. "Now," they said, "if you will get us a cure for our blindness, we will go devote ourselves to your service, and will do whatever you wish." "What is the cure for your blindness?"
"Not far from this place," they said, "a cow comes up from the great sea to graze. A little of her dung could cure us. We should be eternally grateful debtors. Do not let the cow see you, or she will assuredly kill you."
With renewed strength and spirit, I went to the shore, where I watched the cow come up from the sea, graze, and go back. Then I came out of my hiding and took a little dung and covered it in the Peris. They rubbed it in their eyes, and by the divine might see again. They thanked heaven and me, and then considered what they could do to show their gratitude.
"Our King," they said, "has a daughter whom he keeps under his own eye and thinks the most lovely girl on earth. In good sooth, she has no equal. Now we will get you into her house, and you must win her heart. And if she has any inclination for another, you must drive it out and win her for yourself. Her mother loves her so dearly that she has no ease but in her presence, and she will give her no one in marriage. Teach her to love you so that she cannot exist without you. But if the matter becomes known to her mother, she will have you burned in the fire. Then you must beg, as a last favor, that your body be anointed with oil so that you may burn the more quickly and be spared torture. If the Fairy King allows this favor, we two will manage to be your anointers, and we will put an oil on you such that you, for 1,000 years, not a trace of the fire burning shall remain."
In the end, the 2 Peris took me to the girl's house. I saw her sleeping daintily. She was most lovely, and I was amazed at the perfection of her beauty, that I stood with the senses lost, and did not know if she were real or not. And then at last I saw that she was a real girl. I returned my thanks, that I, the runner, had become my goal, that I, the seeker, had found my treasure. When the Peri opened her eyes, she asked in a fright,
"Who are you? Have you come to steal? How did you get here? Be quick, save yourself from the whirlpool of destruction, for the demons and pearls who guard me are awake and seize you."
But love's arrow had struck me deep, and the girl, too, looked kindly on me. I could not go away. For some months I remained hidden in her house. We did not dare to let her mother know of our love. Sometimes the girl was very sad and fearful lest her mother should come to know. One day her father said to her, "Sweetheart, for some time I have noticed that your beauty is not what it was. How is this? What sickness has touched you? Tell me, so I may speak the cure." Alas, there was no way of concealing the mingled delights and anguish of our love. From secret had it become known. I was put in prison, and the world grew dark to my rose, bereft of her lover. The Peri King ordered me to be burnt, and said, "Why have you, a man, done this perfidious thing in my house?" His demons and Peris collected amber wood and made a pile, and would have set me on it. When I remembered the word of life from the 2 Peris I had rescued from the breathed in my ear, and asked that my body might be rubbed in oil to release me the sooner from torture. This was allowed, and those 2 contrived to be anointers. I was put into the fire, and it was kept up for 7 days and nights. By the will of the great king, it left no trace upon me. At the end of the week, the Peri King ordered that the ashes be cast upon the dust heap, and I was found alive and unharmed. Paris, who had seen Gil consumed by her love for me, now interceded with the king and said, "It is clear that your daughter's fortunes are bound up with his, for the fire has not hurt him. It is best to give him the girl, for they love one another. He is the king of Wak of Quaff, and you will find none better." To this king agreed, and made a formal marriage of Gil and me. Now you know, Prince, I paid for this faithless creature. Oh, Prince, remember our compact. "I remember," said the prince, "but tell me what brought Queen Gull to this present pass." "One night," continued King Sinubar, "I was aroused by feeling Gull's hands and feet deadly cold against my body. Cold feet. I asked her where she had been to get so cold, and she said she had to go out. Next morning, when I went to the stable, I saw that two of my horses, Windfoot and Tiger, were thin and worn out. I reprimanded the groom and beat him. He asked where the fault lay, and said that every night my wife took one or the other horses and rode away, and came back only just before dawn. A flame kindled in my heart, and I asked myself where she could go and what she could do. I told the groom to be silent and bring it to me. The next day I did not hunt. I stayed at home to follow my matter up. I lay down as usual at night and pretended to fall asleep. When I seemed safely off, Gull got up and went to the stable as was her custom. That night it was Tiger's turn. She rode off on him, and I took Windfoot and followed. Within that time, that dog you see, the faithful friend who never left me. When I came to the foot of those hills which lay outside the city, I saw Gull dismount and go towards a house which some negroes had built there. Over against the door was a high seat, and on it lay a giant negro before whom she salaamed. He got up and beat her till she was marked with wheals, and she uttered no complaint. I was dumbfounded, for once when I had struck her with the rose stalk, she had complained and fretted all 3 days. And the negro said to her, "How now, ugly one and shaven head? Why are you so late, and why are you not wearing wedding garments?" She answered him, "That person did not go to sleep quickly. He stayed at home all day, and I was not able to adorn myself. I came as soon as I could." In a little while he called her to sit beside him, but this was more than I could bear. I lost control of myself and rushed upon him. He clutched my collar and grappled in the death struggle. Suddenly she came up behind me and caught my feet and threw me. While he had held me on the ground, she drew out my own knife and gave it to him. I should have been killed but for my faithful dog, which seized his throat and pulled him down and pinned him to the ground. Then I got up and dispatched the wretch. There were 4 other negroes that got up and dispatched. 3 I killed, and the 4th got away, and has taken refuge beneath the throne of Marhuas, daughter of King Quimus. I took Gull back to my palace, and from the time now until I treated her as a dog is treated. And I have cared for my dog as though it were my wife. Okay. Now you know what the rose did to the cypress, and now you must keep compact with me. "I shall keep my word," said the prince, "but may a little water be taken to the roof so that I may take my last absolution?" To this request the king consented. The prince mounted onto the roof and, getting into a corner, struck his fire steel and burned one of the Sturga's feathers in the flame. Straightway it appeared, and by the majesty of its presence made the city quake. It took the prince on its back and soared away at the zenith. After a time, King Sinuabar said, "The young man is a long time on the roof. Go and bring him here." But there was no sign of the prince upon the roof, only far away in the sky. The Simar was seen carrying him off. When the king heard of his escape, he thanked heaven that his hands were clean of this blood. Up and up flew the Simar till the earth looked like an egg resting in the ocean. At length it dropped straight down into its own place, where a kind of prince was welcomed by the young birds and hospitality entertained. He told the whole story about the rose and Cypress, and then, laden with gifts, which Simmer had gathered from the cities far and near, he set his face for the castle of clashing swords. The king lion came out to greet him. He took the negro chief's daughter, who was also named Gull, in lawful marriage, then marched with her and his possessions and her attendants to the Palace of Gifts. There they were halted for the night, and at dawn said goodbye to the king lion and set out for Jamila's country. When Lady Jamila heard of Prince Almas was near, she went out with many a fair handmaiden to give him a loving reception. Their meeting was joyful, and they went together to the garden palace. Jamila summoned her notables, and at their presence her marriage with the prince was solemnized. 2 wives. A few days later she entrusted her affairs to her vizier and made preparation to go with the prince to his own country. Before she started, she restored all the men whom her sister Latifa had bewitched to their own forms, and received their blessings and set them forward to their homes. The wicked Latifa herself was quite alone in her garden house. When all was ready, they set out with all her servants and slaves, all her treasure and goods, and journeyed to the city of King Quimus. When Quimus heard of the approach of such a great company, he sent out his vizier to give the prince honorable meeting, and had to ask what procured him the favor of the visit. The prince sent back word that he had no thought of war, but he wrote, "Learn and know, King Quimus, that I am here to end the crimes of your insolent daughter, who has tyrannously done to death many kings and kings' sons, and has hung their heads on your citadel. I am here to give her the answer to the riddle." Later on he entered the city, beat boldly on the drums, and was conducted to the presence. The king entreated him to have nothing to do with the riddle, for that no man had come out of it alive. "O king," replied the prince, "it is to answer it that I am here. I will not withdraw." Mirafruz told that one man more had staked his head on her question, and that this one was one who said he knew the answer. At the request of the prince, all the officers and notables of the land were summoned to hear his reply to the princess. All assembled, and the king and his queen Golruk and the girl and the prince were there. The prince addressed Amr Farutz. "What is the question you ask?" "What did the rose do to the cypress?" she rejoined. The prince smiled and turned and addressed the assembly. "You who are experienced men and versed in affairs, did you ever know or hear or see anything of this matter?" "No," they answered. "No one has ever heard or seen the aught about it. It is an empty fancy." "From whom, then, did the princess hear of it? This empty fancy is that has done many servant to God to death." All saw good sense in his words, and showed their approval. Then he turned to the princess. "Tell the truth, princess. Who told you of this thing? I know it hair by hair and in and out, but if I tell you what I know, who is there to say that I speak the truth? You must produce the person who can confirm my words." Her heart sank, and she feared that her long-kept secret was now to be noised abroad. But she said merely, "Explain yourself." "I shall explain myself fully when you bring the Negro from whom you hide beneath your throne." Here the king shouted in wonderment, "Explain yourself, young man! What Negro does my daughter hide beneath her throne?" "That," said the prince, "you will see if you order to be brought here the Negro who will be found beneath the throne of your princess." Messengers were forthwith dispatched to the garden house, and after a while they returned bringing the negro whom they had discovered in a secret chamber underneath the throne of Mahira Frus, dressed in a dress of home and honor, and surrounded with luxury. The king was overwhelmed with astonishment, but the girl had taken heart again. She had had time to think that perhaps the prince had heard of the presence of Negro and knew no more. So she said hotly, "Prince, you have not solved my riddle." "Oh, amazingly impudent person," cried he. "Do you not yet repent?" Then he turned to the people and told them the whole story of the rose and the cypress, of King Sonoabar and Queen Gull. When he came to the killing of the Negroes, he said to one who stood before them, "You too were present." "That is so. What happened as you have told it." There was a great rejoicing in the court and all through the country over the solving of the riddle, and because now no more kings and princes would be killed. King Quimus made over his daughter to Prince Almas, but the latter refused to marry her and took her as his captive. He then asked that the heads should be removed from the battlements and given decent burial. This was done. He received from the king everything that belonged to Mahira Fritz, her treasure of gold and silver, her costly stuffs and carpets, her household plenishings, the horses, camels, servants, slaves, etc. Then he returned to his camp and sent for Dilaram, who came bringing her goods and chattels, her gold and her jewels. When all was ready, Prince Alams set off for home, taking with him Jamila and Dilaram and Gul, the daughter of Taramtak, and the wicked Marafrutz, and all the belongings of all four, packed on camels and horses, and in carts without number. He approached the border of his father's country. Word of his coming went before him, and all the city came forth to welcome him home. King Saman Laupush, Jessamine, wearer of rubies, had also bewept the loss of his sons, that he was now blind. When the prince had kissed his feet and received his blessing, he took from a casket a little Psalm of Solomon, which Serma had given him, and which reveals all hidden things on earth, and rubbed it on his father's eyes. A light came, and the king saw his son. That means it was Countdown. Merifert was brought before the king, and the prince said, "This is the murder of your sons. Do with her as you will." The king fancied that the prince might care for this girl's beauty, and replied, "You have humbled her. Do with her as you will." Upon this, the prince sent for 4 swift and strong horses, and had the negro bound to each one of them. Then each was driven to one of the 4 quarters, and he was torn to pieces like muslin. This frightened Mahir horribly, for she thought the same thing might be done to herself. "Oh, Prince Amas," said the hardest, was the hardest and most to get to valued. "Up till now I had been subject to no man, and no man had my love. The many kings and kings' sons who have died at my hands died because it was their fate to die like this. It is in this matter I have not sinned. It was their fate to die from eternity, and from yours to beginning to be predestined in the fates to be bound up with yours." The prince gave ear to the arguments from preordainment, and as she was very lovely maiden, he took her too into lawful marriage. 4. She and Jamila set up house together, and Dilaram and Gul set up theirs. The prince passed his life with pure and perfect happiness, and pleasant and sociable entertainment. Now, has been told what the rose did to the cypress. And on, and on, and on. That was clearly one of the tales of Arabian Nights, because that was definitely her style of storytelling. Oh man, that was a long story. It's going to be so weird when I get to 1001 Arabian Nights that I'm going to find that story again. That was probably at least a 4 or 5 night story. But as that story is thankfully over, let us see who is on that we can raid. Or if anyone has a suggestion, by all means, you can either spend points and let me know, or just, let me know. Because I'm not sure how many people have points yet. That was definitely one of Shahrazad's stories. Shahrazad, yeah. Oh. Any suggestions? Raiders? Anyone? Thank you, Sammy, for the raid, and Mini Yeti for the follow. That is awesome. So, man, Shahrazad is long-winded. I don't see any of my fellow storytellers on right now. Don't see anyone who is not my affiliate yet. Let me see who's on. And I'm talking to myself. I drank a bottle and a half of water during the story. Guess we could just find someone completely new and random. Let's do that. We'll pull up stories. Well, not storyteller, but tag on VTubers. See who has the lowest number. And I guess, I don't know. Again, if anyone has any suggestions, by all means, toss them out there. Still don't know he's over. Doppelganger. Can't tell they do anything. Oh, I know she's just not on. I'm not seeing anyone. I really wish there were more storytellers I could help out.
course, it'd be great if we had our own tag. So, why am I having a song Dancing with Myself in my head? I'm going to just read Dusk. So, I do have read messages for both followers and for subscribers. If you want to use either one of those, it's cool. If not, it's still cool. Got my points redeemed to be able to get the. Ouch. Got a cat standing on my arm, making it really hard for me to type. Because he's a butt. Hey, why am I not chatting yet? Oh, okay. There we go. But. Okay, my cat's not letting me type right now because he's standing on my arm. Phantom, say hello to the audience. No? Okay. Let's read Dusk. Sure, most of you know Dusk by now. So, let's read her. Again, we got the two different Story Wolf raid calls, so feel free to choose either one. And I will see you next Thursday for Sherlock Holmes if I don't decide to randomly play games. So, have a good evening, good night, good morning, good afternoon, whichever you may have. And I will see you over in Dusks. Later,